Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Barb just wanted to be left alone. However, that was hard to accomplish when her next-door neighbor was an overly friendly chatterbox with far too much time on her hands, and societal politeness kept Barb from just turning around and closing the door on her. Which wasn't to say that Barb hated her new neighbor. She just wasn't particularly fond of company, at least company she hadn't planned in advance. Lindy Lou Jeffrey, however, was a woman cursed with the love of spontaneity and socializing. Also, she had one of those annoying baby doll voices that Barb just couldn't listen to for very long. Lindy Lou's voice was naturally high-pitched and gushy, like she was talking to a small child. It had an accidental air of condescension to it that was an affront to anyone older than 3. So it was the perfect voice for a preschool teacher, which is exactly what Lindy Lou was. Even her name screamed, "I work with toddlers for a living."
I was just talking with Jeff about having you and your husband over for dinner sometime.
Lindy Lou cooed sweetly, ever chipper.
You're free next weekend, I hope.
Barb was taken aback by 2 things at that moment. One of which was the realization that Lindy Lou's husband was actually named Jeff Jeffrey, which brought on all kinds of questions, mainly how much did his parents hate him? And second was that Lindy Lou had asked about Barb's husband. Barb did not have a husband. She glanced pointedly at her driveway where her only car sat. Any married couple or small family unit had at least 2 cars. That should be obvious to anyone. "I don't have a husband," Barb said, a bit more curtly than she'd intended. She raised her hands to show the lack of a wedding band on any finger. Secretly, she was glad to deflect the conversation away from a dinner invitation. Lindy Lou blinked, her long, well-made-up eyelashes fluttering in clear confusion. Barb supposed you didn't really need a great deal of intelligence to be a preschool teacher, just a lot of optimism, energy, and patience, which Lindy Lou seemed to have in spades. Barb could respect that in a woman. Too much intelligence could lead to overthinking and poor social skills, which was her own personal cross to bear. Lindy Lou's lack of concern for any annoyance her persistent friendliness might cause was something Barb was a bit jealous of.
Then who was that man I saw in your yard the other day?
Mrs. Jeffrey asked, her lip coming up in a little pout.
Did you have somebody over?
"I don't think I did," Barb replied in her usual dry tone, which masked the uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. "What did he look like?"
Oh, I didn't really see much. Just the back of him, for a moment. It was just a blink, though. I might have just imagined it. Anyway, it was good to chat with you, Barbie honey, but I've got to get baking. School's got a bake sale coming up. Oh, you know what? Maybe you can help me? I'll just tittle on back when I'm done so you can taste test a few things. Give me your honest opinion, and you can also give me your answer about dinner.
Oh, sure. Barb felt both a sense of relief that the conversation was over and dread that she'd have to go through the whole awkward exchange sometime in the future. Also, she hated being called Barbie by anyone. "I'll be seeing you."
Bye-bye!
Lindy Lou crooned out her farewell and sashayed her way back to her front porch. Barb was more than happy to scuttle back into her lair and lock the door behind her, to return to what she had been meaning to do before Lindy Lou's impromptu arrival. Barb marched out the back door onto the porch with a bag of Tomcat in her hand, staring at the directions without really reading them. She was stewing with annoyance over the time she'd lost being trapped by Lindy Lou's lack of self-awareness. She had deadlines to meet for one thing, and she'd rather spend her weekend playing around in her new garden than talking about bake sales and toddlers. She supposed Lindy Lou couldn't really be villainized. She probably hadn't had anyone to talk to, and Jeff Jeffrey didn't seem to be the sort of person who was a font of conversation. According to what Barb had bothered to glean, he worked in the IT department of some firm or other, and he looked exactly like the sort who would. She had only caught sight of the top of him in a rare instance in Lindy Lou's backyard one late evening, obscured by bushes, and she had not been impressed. He was a stooped, hunch-shouldered sort, with a small but very pointed nose with an upper jaw that went so far forward that it made his teeth stick out and give him a sort of snout-like look. He could have some muskrat in his ancestry if Barb was any sort of judge. He was proof to her theory that attractive women married ugly men, which would be all right if he had personality. But her encounters with him had been brief, awkward eye contact, which he'd held for too long, before he disappeared without so much as a word or a wave. He probably hadn't had a chance to open his mouth in all his years of marriage and had forgotten how to speak. Barb could almost feel a kinship with him. He clearly had about as much social grace as she did. But the Jeffries' marital woes were only speculation and were none of her business. Maybe Jeff Jeffrey liked listening to his wife's baby doll voice and couldn't be happier. Maybe Lindy Lou had a thing for muskrats who worked with computers. Barb had her own problems, one of which was trying to figure out if there actually had been anyone in her yard, and the other was the mole. As far as she could tell, there were no signs of any shoe prints and nothing was taken. No one had tried to get into the house or the shed. It was something to watch out for, but nothing to be paranoid about just yet. Now that that was done, she went to inspect the damage done by the mole. The back half of her yard was adorned with ridges of dark soil that sunk when stepped in, a complete minefield of booby traps and potential broken ankles. Barb put her hands on her hips and surveyed her ravaged domain. He'd been busy, and there was almost something deliberate and geometric about the patterns of tunnels that interrupted the sea of green grass. "He's making crop circles," she said aloud, knowing it was ridiculous, but it almost seemed true. That's what made it so funny and infuriating. Barb loved nothing more than to spend her free time gardening, but she couldn't really get started on anything if this pest wasn't dealt with. He'd just tear up roots and sink the landscaping. He had to go. She tried to be a bit more humane about it, but the traps never caught him. So poison it would have to be. She set to work laying the bait in the dirt before she was satisfied with what she'd accomplished and went back inside to wash her hands and make lunch. "You have got to be kidding me!" She ground her teeth as she stood on her back porch the next morning with a cup of coffee in her hand. It looked like the poison had only provided new energy and nourishment to the little bastard. In one night, he tore up the entire yard with an intricate network of tunnels, which all seemed to be a little deeper and a little more pronounced. It was like he was giving her a very clear middle finger. What was worse, her back porch was slanting. The right corner was starting to sink into the ground as the support had been caved in. Barb wasn't sure who she should contact first, an exterminator or a contractor. But it seemed reasonable that there'd be no point in fixing the porch until the beast below had been properly dealt with. This was war. The pest control people had agreed to come out sometime in the next 3 days. Barb couldn't help but wonder if there was anything left of her house in the next 3 days. Probably just a roof sticking out of the top of the ground like a stubby pyramid. The thought made her laugh. It was when the evening rolled around and she was washing dishes and contemplating the expenses of contractors, exterminators, and buying new plants that it occurred to her that Lindy Lou hadn't ever come back with her bake sale samples. Barb had actually forgotten about it and thought it was weird that Mrs. Jeffrey had not come by for a second visit yesterday evening. Maybe baking had taken a lot more out of her than she'd expected, or something had come up. Curious, she glanced with more concentration to the Jeffreys' house. From her own kitchen window, she could see both the windows into her neighbor's laundry room and half of their backyard. Since it was evening, the lights provided a better view inside. She could actually see the back of what looked like a man with broad shoulders and blonde hair ironing a shirt. Barb frowned. That wasn't Jeff. It was then that some movement in the Jeffreys' yard caught her attention, and she jumped a little. Well, there was Jeff. Or at least the top of him, a bit hard to make out in the dim light, but visible enough to be recognized, squinting with his tiny dark eyes over the white picket fence and creeping shrubbery. He was staring right at her. Barb inhaled through her teeth, blood flushing to her cheeks at being caught spying. But she gave a nervous little grin and raised a hand in greeting. She supposed the man ironing his shirt could be a relative or a family friend. As soon as she waved, Jeff's head vanished again behind the shrubs as though ducking down to avoid being spotted. Barb stood on tiptoe to catch sight of him, but couldn't see anything. The leaves rattled a little bit, but then they went still, and that was it. Unsettled, Barb quickly shut off her own kitchen light, deciding the rest of the dishes could wait until morning. She went to the living room to be comforted by television, not too keen on trying to understand her eccentric next-door neighbor. For all she knew, he could be the one who Lindy Lou had seen in her yard. The thought made her feel a bit queasy, but she supposed there could be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a pet had wandered into her yard and he decided to retrieve it without the awkwardness of having to ring the doorbell. Or maybe he hadn't been in her yard at all and she was just being paranoid. Nighttime had a way of making everything seem worse. But she didn't sleep very well that night, so she woke up closer to lunchtime than she normally would have. The first thing that Barb wanted was a shower. She marched into the bathroom, bleary-eyed and yawning, and turned the faucet to run some hot water. Thick black mud drizzled and spurted into her tub, and it took a moment for Barb's brain to register and act on what she was seeing. She shut off the tap quickly, now fully awake, cursing, her arms and pajama top splattered with wet dirt. She spat some out of her mouth and continued to cuss as she stomped over to the sink and turned that on. A spray of dirty water burst out of that as well, and she wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. But it really wasn't time to be hysterical. She had to call somebody. Calling a handyman wasn't too socially taxing, not like calling a relative or a friend. That required conversation and thus a bit more anxiety. Calling someone to fix your pipes or remove a burrowing pest was different. You just told them the problem, and they told you the price and when they were available, and then you were done. They couldn't reject you because they needed money. Though the added cost to the already dwindling budget due to Murphy's Law coming to bite her in the ass was its own cause for anxiety. And she couldn't remember where she'd left her phone. So she started wandering around her house in a nervous, jittery daze to find it. As she walked past the back door, she paused a second to look out, and then had to look again to make sure her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. She had no back porch. What she had was a half-sunken pile of collapsed wood and debris, and a 3-foot drop from the door to the ground. Her mouth hung open in disbelief and horror before she redoubled her efforts to find her phone. Checking each window as she passed, she could see more and more distinct patterns in the dirt where the mole had dug tunnels. Her heart started to pound, and she felt the shakes in her limbs revving up in full force. This was too fast. No mole could cause this much destruction so quickly. Something was very wrong. She needed to get the exterminators here pronto. But when she reached the living room, she realized that there was a van parked outside her front lawn. She scrambled onto the couch and leaned against the back of it to push aside her sheer white curtains. Her eyes bulged. The van with the exterminators logo and phone number painted on the side was there outside all right, but her front yard was an intricate network of dark lines of dirt. It looked like the front porch had sunk a few inches in the front because she couldn't remember it being so slanted. She bit her lip and got up on unsteady legs. She unlocked the front door and inched her way onto her front porch. She continued to walk slowly until she reached the edge of the concrete steps, peering around for any sign of the exterminators. The van looked empty, and there wasn't anyone wandering the tunnel-strewn yard. She hadn't seen any sign of them in the backyard either. She was resolving herself to make a run across the lawn to the van for a closer look, her foot just barely touching the dirt, when something shot out of the earth and made an intentional snatch for her ankle. Barb shrieked and kicked out wildly, barely managing to stop herself from getting caught, but not being able to keep from losing her footing. She hit the ground hard. The skin scraped off her elbow and wrists. She scrambled back onto the safety of the porch, staring bug-eyed as a mud-caked claw the size of a man's hand pawed and scraped at the place she'd just been, before disappearing back into the earth with a gurgly-sounding growl to be replaced by a mound of dirt. Barb had a pretty good idea what happened to the exterminators as she fled into the safety of her home, locking the door behind her with shaking hands, too speechless with fright to even cuss. She scooped up her phone from the coffee table where she'd left it last night and crawled onto the couch, her feet tucked as close to her body in a fetal position as she could manage. Her right foot was caked in dirt, and there was a little blood starting to dry where the dirty claw had scraped her skin. She found she didn't care that much. She only wanted to pull back the curtain and stare out the window for any sign of the thing, her phone gripped, white-knuckled in her hot, sweaty hand. Who did you call for this kind of problem? The police? More exterminators? The fire department? Maybe this needed bigger guns like the FBI or the Army. But she didn't know their number, and they might not believe her. She didn't even believe it herself. So far, there wasn't any sign of something crawling about underground, but she wasn't about to go out and test that. The sound of a screen door opening and closing caught Barb's attention. Lindy Lou came bustling out of her front door with a Tupperware container full of cookies and a concerned look on her face. She made her determined way towards Barb's front lawn, and Barb's mouth opened to scream out something, anything. She didn't know what. All that came out was a croak, like a dying animal. Don't. Mrs. Jeffrey's house slippers held her weight on the lawn for only a fraction of a second. And then she screamed as she sunk up to her waist in dirt. Barb watched, frozen and helpless, barely able to breathe, let alone get up and run to her neighbor's aid, as Lindy Lou struggled and continued to sink. Her pale hands, fingernails painted in purple polish, scratched and clawed at the earth that kept her trapped. The one solid patch that held her up could cave in at any moment for her to fall through to whatever abyss lay below. Barb glanced toward Lindy Lou's house with what strength she had left, in an effort at tearing her gaze away from the mesmerizing horror of the situation. And there was Jeff. He was crouched, staring at Lindy Lou with tiny squinty eyes. Barb only wondered a second why he wasn't running to his wife's aid, before she realized what she was really looking at. Jeff wasn't wearing any clothes. He was caked in mud. His hands were like long, clawed shovels, and he suddenly bent forward and started to feverishly dig into the earth before vanishing into it. Barb didn't hear the screen door over Lindy Lou's cries for help, but she saw a broad-shouldered man with blonde hair and a beard race out from the Jeffreys' house towards her. She saw a pair of clawed and muddy hands reach out from the dirt and drag the rest of Mrs. Jeffrey down into the earth. Her screams cut off abruptly, and the ground around the man, who was actually Jeff Jeffrey, who worked in the IT department, swallowed him up after his wife. Barb sat there, unable to look away from the window, trapped in her house and alone. She thought with bitter irony as she heard the sound of mud-caked claws scraping against her wood floors that was exactly what she had wanted just 2 days ago.
Most of my childhood memories are like charcoal drawings, the edges frayed, the images smudged and bleeding. But not this one. Not him. The first time I saw the backward man was when I was 7. Mom and I were at a stoplight. It was spring, a light mist blowing down, but not too cold, and I happened to glance up before the colors changed. There he was, standing on the other side of the street with his back to me, top hat nearly scraping the traffic light. I remember pointing him out as we crossed, spouting something like, "Look, Mom, look how tall that man is." And she did look, stopping just long enough to tilt her head before the car horn blared. What happened next seared my brain like a high-voltage camera flash. This rapid snap, 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 perma-scorching my synapses. I fly into empty air. Bones crunch somewhere behind me. Metal. Asphalt bites my skin and I'm rolling, rolling, rolling. Blood in my mouth, my eyes. I try to wipe it off, but my arm won't work right. My fingers are a mangled mess. Faces blur overhead, lips pull wide. A set of tobacco-soaked teeth scream, "Call an ambulance," and I'm bawling, Have been for some time, these huge, gulping sobs crawling up my throat. Mommy! I spot her a few feet away, her summer sundress spattered red, a long grease patch down the thigh, torn. My gaze drifts higher to where the fabric strains against her abdomen, her belly tight with my baby brother, and I just know she's gone. Then I'm gazing beyond her toward the backward man, so incredibly tall. That beyond black suit and the pink splotch neck tucked beneath his ragged top hat. The thin fringe of hair there. The withered hands. Tears blurring him away. The backward man appeared every so often after that. Maybe once a year, twice. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Every time, though, it was as if he were some sort of silent, blaring alarm. This harbinger of doom that only I could see, could feel. Prickly sensations like a swarm of centipedes racing down my legs. A heavy, tensing weight in my gut. I'd look up and there he was. Always backwards, always dressed in his tattered frock coat and black wool trousers, shoulder blades cutting sharp against the cloth, his razor blade neck climbing, finally disappearing into that threadbare top hat. Something was off about the skin beneath it. It was plastic looking, the tissue shiny moist, shining like it had been freshly coated in Vaseline. There were more car wrecks, one so bad that 4 teenagers died on the spot. Dad was there for that one, hustling me away, doing his best to shield my eyes with his hands. It didn't matter. I saw most of it. Flickers of broken bodies and warped metal. The backward man perched beyond the carnage and warped by heat waves. A skeleton in a suit. The image haunted me for weeks, the nightmares far longer. It went on like that, over and over, for years. The death of my sweet boxer Buck, poisoned by a loaf of bread drenched in antifreeze. My Aunt Debbie's breast cancer, the backward man painting a cold shadow just outside the bedroom window as Dad took the call. I see. Okay, we'll be right there. I told Dad about the backward man a few times. He'd nod and pretend to listen, fingers steepled like he was paying attention, but he wasn't. Not really. I think that he chalked my stories up to trauma from Mom's death, said I'd hit my head too hard that day. That, and he was only ever half there anyways, his eyes distant and red-rimmed, vacancy sign blinking. I'm pretty sure the only things that kept him going were me and my brother. Especially my brother. At first, he had treated Jake like this fragile piece of Mom he'd somehow saved. This NICU miracle draped in IV lines. A reason for him to get up in the morning. He'd say all the usual stuff as Jake grew. Tell him to put his helmet on when he rode his bike and to never ever talk to strangers. To look both ways before crossing the street. But it didn't last. Mom's death had ruined him. Hollowed him out, something in his gaze reminding me of a TV show bleeding static after a few drinks. So I lived like that, trapped in this awful shell, watching over my brother, thinking I was nuts, scared out of my mind, until the day I realized the backward man didn't like fire. We were out in the Cascades when it happened. Just me and Jake and Dad, camped next to a purple sliver of lake. The sun had nearly set, the air heavy with pine, when that familiar tingle burned up my spine. It took a moment, but I spotted him tucked away in a gray-blue strand of fur, his frame more shadow than light, his torso blotting out what remained of the day. I remember staring at him, mouth dry, stomach churning, as he edged from the tree line. His knees buckled in reverse, the movement all wrong, unnatural. A sick, lumbering step. Snap, crunch. Another. Snap, crunch, snap. I opened my mouth to cry out, to say anything at all, but my voice was lodged in the small part of my throat, trapped there. He drew closer, his neck crystallizing into a swirl of moist, pink-white flesh, his shoulders rolling back against his coat. So tall. Then Dad was lighting the fire, and the backward man was simply gone. "Earth to Colin," Dad had said, clapping at me a moment later. "You with us?" And just like that, I was, staring at the crackling campfire, the crisp tinge of smoke and earth and air reminding me to breathe again. After a few wobbly breaths, I forced my gaze toward the dark expanse of trees, terrified, eyes stinging, expecting to see that pale snatch of skin again. But I didn't. He was gone, and I knew what that meant. I'd finally found a weapon. I bought an army of Zippos after that, carried them with me wherever I went. One flick of that magical flint, and the backward man would vanish like a groggy nightmare, like he'd never really even been there at all. But he had, and I knew it, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. We moved to Seattle when I was a freshman, Jake in 3rd grade. Dad had landed a supervisor position at a meat packing plant in the city and thought a fresh start was what we needed, what he needed. It wasn't. All that cloud cover only drove him deeper into the bottle. Most nights, he stayed out way too late, forgot to make us breakfast in the morning or do the laundry, the basic stuff. When he stopped taking Jake to school, I knew that was it. It was on me to take care of him. I'm not going to lie. It was hard at first. I mean, we'd played together over the years, but come on, 8-year-old brother in tow everywhere I went? Not cool. Still, I bucked up and got it done. He was a good kid, bushy-tailed and all of that, with the best parts of Mom. Her half-curved smile and eyes like beach water. He had her humor, too, always laughing, spouting off one dumb joke after another. What do you get when you cross an elk with a rhino? It was late one night, Dad out on another one of his benders, when I decided we were due for some fun. We weren't supposed to do that, just up and leave, but I was sick of Dad's shit, and Jake seemed down, so off we went. We hit up the mall, had burgers and shakes, and joked around like normal kids with normal lives. Tried to not look at all the other normal kids eating dinner with their normal parents. I kept Jake distracted, taught him how to dip his fries in his shake like Mom had taught me, watched him smile at the salty, sweet mix, then drug him off to Laser Quest for a few rounds of laser tag. When we finally bowled into the alley a couple hours later, it was past 11 with thick sheets of fog rolling in. We were laughing about how Jake had trounced some kid in a game of air hockey, nothing remotely scary on our mind, when the first cramp rolled up my leg. At first, I thought the shadow was a weird trick of the light, a distortion. Fog did that, warped things sometimes. But when the shadow straightened, I knew. I shot an arm out to stop Jake, but he'd already paused, or maybe never really moved at all. He just stood there, pale-faced, unblinking. My words came out garbled, whitewashed in fear. "Jake, do you see him too?" He didn't answer, only started to wobble straight down the alley before I could stop him. I panicked, snatched the Zippo from my pocket, and bolted past him, flicking the spark wheel like a maniac until the lighter caught. I stopped and held it aloft, the blue flame crackling as my heart clogged my throat. The backward man did nothing. Just stood there facing away, top hat corked to one side, a gluey ribbon of scalp peeking out. Cold paralysis drenched my limbs, my brain. I started to shake as the creature's knees inverted, its elbows. Then he was backing straight for us, joints popping. I glanced at Jake, who'd stopped directly behind me, was staring right through me. I mean, straight through me, like I wasn't even there. A clear string of drool curled off his lip. I knew I had to do something, anything. Frantic, I spotted a pile of cardboard stacked next to a wall of grimy brick and rushed for it. Lit it. The fire was weak at first, the flames licking frailly at a pile of yellowed newspaper beneath the boxes until, with a wave of heat, the stiff pulp caught. When I looked up again, the backward man was gone. I only asked Jake about that night once, his forehead scrunching into a forest of lines when I did. Backwards what? I let it drop after that. If he didn't remember, that was a good thing. No need for both of us to be terrified. Still, the question triggered something in Jake that bothered me. This brief, glassy-eyed look that let me know the backward man wasn't finished, that he'd be back. I just didn't know when. It happened late one night in August. It had been unbearably hot, blankets of humidity blowing off the sound, and the AC had broken. Dad hadn't bothered to fix it, just like so many other things in the house, so I'd taken to sleeping with my window open. I'm not exactly sure what woke me. Maybe it was the wind ruffling the dogwoods at the edge of our lawn, or maybe it was the moonlight washing through the blinds. Whatever it was, I snapped awake like something out of a movie. I mean, I just sat straight up in bed, sheened in sweat. There was something wrong with my stomach, and this awful smell hung in the air. Imagine an abandoned slaughterhouse in deep summer, miles of spoiled meat. Worse than that. I bolted to my feet and crept to the window. Sure enough, he was there, frock coat billowing in the breeze, partially obscured by a dense bank of rhododendron. Buttery moonlight bled through the clouds, drenching him in a sick, dusty light, like something a child might sketch on a chalkboard after a nightmare, but so much worse. And there was Jake, walking straight for him. I moved, snatched my Zippo, and was about to hurtle over the windowsill when the memory of the alley burned hot. A lighter wouldn't cut it. I reversed course and pounded for the garage, threw on the light and searched desperately for the gas can. I found it beneath Dad's workbench among a swirl of dust motes and grabbed it along with a wad of paper towels, ran to the backyard, stopped cold. The backward man had knelt, his arms slung in reverse as if beckoning Jake in for a hug, elbows cutting impossible angles. I moved at that, burst across the grass in a nervous rush and uncapped the gas can. Several paper towels fluttered from my grip, but I managed to jam most of them in the top before sliding in front of Jake. I sparked the lighter and brought the flame down, ready to light it, when Jake thudded into my back. The gas can tumbled from my grip, and I watched in horror as it hit the turf, the flame guttering out instantly. The backward man shifted, as if noticing me for the first time, then slowly uncoiled into an impossibly black shadow, save for the flesh of his wrists. Something off about the skin there. It was moving, rippling with a familiar motion that took me a second to place. Boiling. His skin was boiling, blackening as he edged closer, tendrils of ash coiling off his fingers in little sparks. And that's what saved us. A single spark drifting off his wrist. It wavered there, hung like a firefly in the air for a terrible moment, before finally settling into the pool of gas glug-glugging toward the backward man's feet. The gas caught in a hot whoosh, the flames leaping up his legs in bright orange drifts. I'd like to say that he screamed, but the sound that came out was something else entirely. A piercing cry, like being thrust into the middle of an interstate pileup with 1,000 brakes screeching at once. This endless, metallic squeal that dropped me to my knees and forced my hands to my ears. It didn't matter. The sound ricocheted through my skull like a stray bullet, went on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, before the backward man was galloping away in a thick plume of smoke. When he vanished into the dogwoods, I pulled a hand from my ear and stared dumbly at the black slice of blood staining my palm. Jake said something behind me, and I turned, flinching at the twin curtains of blood leaking from his ears, his hair thick with sweat, matted. He was blinking hard as if trying to focus, rubbing his eyes. "Huh?" I said. "What are we doing out here?" He looked at me like he used to when he was 4, confused, but his face full of trust, wrinkled up like I could somehow solve this, like I had an answer for whatever the hell had just happened. I didn't. All I knew was, at that moment, I would do whatever it took to protect him, to make sure the backward man never hurt him again. I moved my bed into Jake's room after that, slept next to the window and kept his door locked. Dad thought I was nuts, tried to get me to go back to my room, finally conceding after a few weeks with a weary, "I guess it doesn't hurt anything." Jake, on the other hand, loved it. We played video games until midnight, talked more than we ever had. Sports, girls, what we wanted to be when we grew up. When he fell asleep, I stayed on watch until my eyelids turned to concrete, staring out the window and pinching myself awake. Never again. "Colin," Jake said one night, his gaze on the ceiling, unfocused. "What was she like?" "Mom?" "Yeah." I pictured her. A cascade of chestnut hair, her face smudged around the edges, the memory fading even now. "I don't remember much, buddy," I said. "But I can remember she loved me. And you. Especially you. She was so excited to meet you." He was silent for a moment, mouth twisted to the side, wistful. "Me too." A few years passed without incident. Jake grew up, fell into drama, acted in a few plays, and took guitar lessons. Began painting, another piece of Mom surfacing. Her paintings still hung in the living room, summer skies draped in lush purples, bright blue fields of cornflowers. My favorite hung near the front door, an oceanscape of Mom and I, my hand in hers. Dad on the other side in a candy red raincoat with an arm slung over her shoulder. All of us looking out at the break. Better days. It hurt Dad, that painting. I sometimes caught him staring at it, limp beer in hand. No idea I was right there breaking with him. Besides that, things were pretty normal, though not normal enough to blot out the memory of Jake slogging across the lawn like a back alley drunk. Nothing could erase that from my mind. So I did the only thing I could. I prepared. And let me tell you, it's amazing what you can find on the dark web if you're dedicated enough. It's true what they say. It's a bad place full of bad shit. Drugs and stolen credit cards and extremist agendas. Weird porn. Crap that I wanted nothing to do with. I was only interested in one thing: learning how to build a kick-ass Molotov cocktail. It took me a while to find the right recipe. A lot of experimenting. A lot of burns. One second-degree scorcher over my wrist, before I settled on a highly illegal mix of carbon disulfide, white phosphorus, and sulfur. Something that would ignite on contact with oxygen. I could cap the bottles that way. No messy ignition rag to deal with, no smell, and best of all, no way anyone could tell I was carrying a couple of firebombs in my backpack. Jake was a freshman by then, and part of me wanted to let up a bit and enjoy my life. I mean, I'd sacrificed college to watch over the kid, was working a crap job down at the Grease Monkey just to help Dad pay the bills. I wanted to convince myself that I'd earned it, that the backward man was gone for good, but I knew he wasn't. Could feel it in my gut, and the image of Jake consumed by all that boiling flesh without me there to protect him scared the hell out of me. So I doubled down and smothered him instead. Did whatever I could to be with him as much as possible. Coached his soccer teams, took him to play practice, and drove him anywhere he needed to go. Doctor appointments, study dates, trips to friends' houses, all of that. And I still slept in his room, even when he bugged me not to, all the while on edge, waiting for the backward man to return. Waiting. I slipped up in December. Jake had landed the lead in some play set during the Civil War. I vaguely remember the irritation I felt when he told me, face beaming. I forced a smile to cover the cringe inside. It would mean more carting him around, more time I didn't have carved out of my schedule. Still, I knew it was good for the kid, so I congratulated him and told myself to buck up. I didn't realize how big of a deal the play was until opening night. It seemed the entire school was there in tightly packed rows. Dads dressed in plaid sport coats and brightly colored sweaters. Moms hissing under-the-breath threats at siblings squirming over the seats. The entire place buzzing with body heat. Even Dad was there, sober and stretched out next to me in the first row, looking half interested. He clapped me on the back right before it started, looking happier than he had in a while. The first scene was a battle. The North versus the South, complete with a fog machine and the snap of cap gun rifles, everything seeming to go off without a hitch. I even found myself enjoying it. The kids barking out their lines with gusto, the play director, Mr. Johnson, encouraging them with hearty pats on the back side stage, his dress shirt half untucked and swaying. It wasn't until the third act that my stomach began to churn. At first, I thought it was food poisoning, something off about the slice of pizza I'd inhaled earlier. But I knew better the minute Jake took the stage. It was his big scene, the one he'd practiced in front of the mirror for months. The Gettysburg Address. He stood hunched, fake beard plastered to his chin, body stiff beneath his knockoff double-breasted suit. I could tell he was nervous by the way he rocked back on his heels, his hands knuckled tight over the podium. Then, with a sudden swell of confidence, he straightened and cleared his throat. 7 years ago, I don't think I'd ever been as proud of him as I was at that moment. Same with Dad. He was beaming cheek to cheek, looking at Jake the way he used to look at me before Mom died. A younger, fresher version of him planted next to me, a few of the wrinkles washed away. That's when I saw the shadow. It was small at first, a slight alteration in the way the light hit the stage, muted in spots, hazy, but it grew, devouring the floor inch by horrible inch, an oil slick spreading, but blacker, thicker. A top hat formed first, followed by a sharp set of clavicles, a spindly neck. My throat constricted and I reached for my backpack. Clawed, empty air. No. I'd carried it like an oxygen tank, day in and day out for over a year, waiting for this moment, this exact moment, and like an idiot, had left it in the dressing room when I dropped off Jake. I bolted, shoved my way past a tangle of legs, and spun through the door. Go, go, go! Slamming into the dressing room, panicked, eyes hungry for that dark red fabric. By the time I made it back, Jake had deteriorated. Mr. Johnson was hissing lines at him, peppering an otherwise awkward silence. "It is altogether fitting! Altogether fitting!" Jake had turned, was facing the backward man now, his head lolled to the side. The other kids watched him with creased brows, one a popular ponytailed sophomore doing her best to stifle a nervous shot of laughter. I could tell she didn't see the backward man. None of them did. He elongated, his top hat nearly brushing the ceiling now, and beckoned at Jake with those terrible, inverted arms. Jake gurgled something and wobbled off the podium, crashed past a cluster of prop horses and knocked them over. Something like steam lit the air, a dull simmer, and I clambered up onto the stage, flinging the first Molotov in a wild, looping throw that wheeled wide right. The bottle shattered in a searing burst of light. A ripple of confusion rolled through the audience, a muffled scream. Shit! I focused and hurled the second Molotov, harder, thinking, do not miss, do not miss. And then everything happened at once. Jake reaching out for those horrible hands. The bottle bursting into a bright wall of flame that enveloped the curtains, then the backward man, then Jake. I was only vaguely aware of the hell breaking loose behind me, of the screams and toppled chairs and frantic surge for the exits, Dad shouting the entire time, "Colin! Colin, what are you doing?" It was all static as I lunged for Jake and grabbed his arm. It was limp through his sleeve, cold, his mouth unbuckled in a silent scream, all teeth. Then that shrill cry hit, that terrible metal-on-metal wail, and I was pulling, jerking back on Jake like a man possessed, heaving and yelling for him to let go, to please, God, please let go. He didn't. The backward man's grip was steel. A forest of tendons bunched across his fingers and they curled tighter, orange tongues of flame spreading from the creature's arm to Jake's. A thick, grinding sensation pulled my gaze higher toward the backward man's head, which was turning, rotating in place like something from The Exorcist. The eyes appeared first, then a familiar curl of hair, an open mouth screaming through a thin string beard, lips stretched wide. My world fell away. It was Jake. A funhouse mirror version of him, but him all the same. And so wrong. The cheeks were hollowed out and slung with paste-like ribbons of flesh. the eyes bulging, one rolling wildly in place. The other stared directly at me, a burning pupil swimming in a sea of yellow sclera. And its nose, dear God, it had been eaten away, leaving behind 2 gaping holes in the place of nostrils. I realized then that it was crying, as was Jake, both of them howling as the flames chewed through their torsos. My hand fell away, and all I can remember is shaking, convulsing in place as the backward man's flesh congealed with Jake's, thinking, no, 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 as Jake seized into him bit by awful bit. It was this horrible combining, both of them jerking into the other, becoming one another, a melding of arms, legs melting together. I saw it then, what I should have seen all along, the top hats and frock coats billowing with smoke, the wool trousers, everything the same, their ankle boots, their beards, even their postures, both slumped slightly forward. They were the same, exactly the same. The flames expanded, bled over the floor and up my legs, the heat searing, 1,000 nerve endings frying at once. I realized I was screaming too, and had been for some time, echoing the howls of my brother, of the backward man. Hands gripped my shoulders. Someone beat at my legs with a towel, waves of heat rolling over me. I extended an arm toward what was left of my baby brother, my eyes never leaving his as they merged with the backward man's. A pathetic moan was all that escaped my lips before I was dragged away. My legs aren't much to look at these days. I mean, they work and all, sort of. I have a pretty bad limp, but I avoid looking at mirrors whenever I pass. All that twisted, candle wax flesh brings me howling right back to that day, and I don't need the reminder. I live it on repeat. The way Jake just dissolved into him, their flesh searing together, actually twining, his and the backward man's. That glue-colored skin mixing with my brother's like a bad infection. It's enough to make you want to shoot yourself. And I would, if I could, but I can't. You see, I was committed not too long after that night, sentenced to 20 years in the psychiatric wing of King County Correctional, 15 with good behavior. Maybe someday I'll make it to a halfway house, post up on the porch and chain smoke my way through what's left of my life with the rest of the burnouts. Nothing but dead eyes and scorched lungs. But even that would be too kind. 15 people were hospitalized that night. 4 students sent to the ICU with severe smoke inhalation. 2 died. My brother, of course, and the girl I had spotted giggling at him. I can still see her honey blonde hair glowing pink beneath the stage lights. Can still picture the way she swallowed that laugh. Her parents were at my trial, their faces bunched in hate, fists balled hard in their laps. If eyes were daggers, I'd already be dead. Dad never came to my hearings. Hasn't visited me once in the 10 years since. He's never written, never called. If he did, I would tell him what I've told everyone else, that I was trying to protect Jake, as I always had, to save him from the creature in the frock coat that took Mom. It landed me here, that story, planted me in this sweat yellow gown along with the rest of the droolers. No one else saw the backward man that night, not a single person. Still, it doesn't change the fact that it's true, every word of it. I know this because, Despite the solitude, the thinly padded walls and pipes clinking away in the small, dark hours, I'm not lonely. Not in the least. Jake is here with me. He stands in the corner with his top hat crushed beneath the concrete ceiling, his gaze always on me, never blinking, never looking at anything else, only at me. Those two black hole eyes looking like something punched through a wet sheet of paper, his skin a mess of shining pink flesh. Sometimes he tries to speak, his jaw elongating unnaturally, those thin bone hands scraping his knees. But all that comes out is the shriek I know so well, that scraped metal cry that sends a chill racing down my spine every time I hear it. I know that cry will never end. It will drill through my skull and fray my mind, bit by bit. And one day, not too far from now, when I can no longer stand it, it will whittle me down to nothing more than a charcoal imprint. Everything fading away, as if I were never really here at all.
Don't make a mountain out of a molehill.
That's what my dad used to tell me when I was a kid. I never really understood the metaphor back then. I mean, I knew what he was getting at. He thought I was overreacting. The crying, the shouting, the self-harm, all of those were mountains, as far as he was concerned. The molehills? I don't talk about the molehills. For a long time, though, I didn't even know what a molehill was. It stood to reason that a molehill was smaller than a mountain. Otherwise, the saying wouldn't have made any sense. But I had only ever heard the word used in that phrase, never in any other type of conversation. I had no context for it, no frame of reference. I wasn't even sure if that was the word my dad was saying. I thought maybe it was like a misheard song lyric, like when people hear Jimi Hendrix say, "Excuse me while I kiss this guy," instead of, "Excuse me while I kiss the sky." One night when I was 8 years old, I asked my half-sister Delilah what a molehill was. She was 3 years older than me, so I figured she might know. She stopped dabbing the blood from my lip and gave me a puzzled look.
They're everywhere, stupid. Everywhere? Where?
She rolled her eyes and sighed like the answer was the most obvious thing in the world.
Everywhere, everywhere. In the yard, behind the house, in the woods, everywhere.
I peered out the window at the ground outside our trailer home. It was rippled with small mounds of dirt, ranging in size from half a grapefruit to half a basketball. I had seen them my whole life, but I had no idea what they were.
Those out there? Yep.
She balled up the bloody tissue and tossed it into the trash can beside the bed, then licked her thumb and wiped a smear of dried blood from my chin.
Why are they called molehills? Seriously?
Delilah asked. I nodded. She looked me in the eyes, her tone like that of a teacher explaining basic facts to a particularly thick-headed student.
Because they're hills, made by moles.
I didn't know what a mole was either. Delilah explained that it was like a rat, but instead of living in our trash, it lived underground, digging tunnels and occasionally popping up through the ground to breathe. I don't know if that last part was true, but it made sense to me at the time. I found the whole concept of moles fascinating.
What do they eat?
I asked. Delilah shrugged.
I don't know. Dirt, I guess.
As I got older, the molehills got bigger. The mountains got bigger too. The crying turned to drinking, the self-harm into self-destruction. I realized that if I didn't get away from my father, I wasn't going to make it through high school alive. Either my dad was going to kill me, or I was going to kill him. Or both. So when I was a sophomore in high school, I ran away. I got sober, I got a GED, I got a job, and eventually I got better. So much better, in fact, that I never thought about my dad anymore. I never thought about the mountains. Or the molehills. Until today. Today, Delilah called. We had kept in touch here and there over the years, but it had been at least a decade since we last spoke. She told me she was moving to Alabama with her new boyfriend and that someone needed to assume responsibility for our father's care once she was gone. The old man required a pharmacy's worth of meds, multiple times a day. He couldn't be trusted to figure out which meds to take when, and the wrong combination at the wrong times could kill him. So, it fell upon my shoulders to help. At first I said, hell no. I couldn't imagine returning to that place after so many years. But Delilah persisted, and eventually, I gave in. I felt some perverse sense of responsibility that I couldn't explain. The man was my father, after all. He was aging, decrepit, senile, a pathetic shell of his former self. He wasn't the same man he was when I ran away. That's what Delilah told me anyway. And, like an idiot, I believed her. Delilah met me outside our father's trailer just before nightfall, her dented pickup truck creaking to a stop beside my old Toyota Corolla. I had been parked in the gravel driveway for almost an hour, with my foot on the brake and the gear shift on R, staring at a dent in the side of the mold-streaked trailer and trying to will myself to stay. Delilah crossed in front of my car and waved at me through the windshield. "You coming?" Her voice was muffled through the closed windows. I didn't respond. "Earth to Bonnie!" She slapped her palm on the hood of my car. The sound made me flinch. So I uncurled my aching fingers, put the gear shift in park, and killed the engine. It rattled and sputtered for a moment, then fell silent with a final hiss. I took a deep breath and opened the car door. "Hey," I said, as I stepped out onto the driveway. "Hey yourself," she replied with a smirk. Her eyes wandered down my body and then back up to my face. "Long time. You good?" "We'll see." I looked up at the trailer, and the faded curtain in the window over the sink seemed to move just an inch, as if someone had been peeking out. "I'm good too," she said sardonically. "Thanks for asking." She walked up the 3 rotted wooden stairs to the trailer, opened the door, and stepped inside. "Hi, Dad," I heard her say. "Guess who's here?" My stomach lurched at the thought of going into the trailer. It was dirtier and more mildewed than the night I ran away. But otherwise, nothing had changed. It had the same faded Confederate flag sticker in the window, the same tin Miller Lite sign hanging crooked on a rusty screw by the door, and the same pine tree loomed overhead, dumping dead pine needles and sticky sap all over the roof and steps. It was only then that I noticed the molehills. The ground was infested with them. I could have sworn that the yard had been smooth and flat when I pulled into the driveway, but it wasn't anymore. Mounds of wet earth pimpled the landscape in all directions. The mound closest to my car roiled with a mass of squirming earthworms, crumbs of wet earth sticking to their slime-slicked bodies. Delilah poked her head back outside the trailer. "Psst, Bonnie, let's go." "Sorry. Coming." I picked my way through the minefield of molehills until I reached the steps of the trailer. I followed Delilah into the dimly lit den, and the screen door swung shut behind me with a familiar smack. "Look who it is, Dad." Delilah exclaimed. She moved aside so my father and I could see each other. I suppressed a gasp. The last time I saw my dad, he was a hulking beast of a man, with muscled forearms covered in fading greenish-black tattoos from his time in the army. He had broad shoulders and a straight spine, with a head of thick, wavy brown hair and a clean-cut reddish mustache that reminded me of the guy from the brawny paper towels package. The figure before me, however, was nothing like that. He was a mere shadow of the man I knew. He was wearing the same kind of flannel shirt he favored when I was a kid, but now it hung on him like a scarecrow costume draped over a Halloween skeleton. His thinning gray hair stood up in crazy swirls, the color of dryer lint. A dusting of unkempt stubble dirtied his hollow cheeks, making him seem even more emaciated than he already was. His eyes were covered with milky cataracts that dulled his pale blue irises to a ghostly gray. He sat slumped in a sunken recliner scarred with rows of long cigarette burns on the arms. A hungry man microwave dinner, a tall can of Miller Lite, and a kaleidoscope of pills in a small paper cup were arranged on the rolling tray in front of him. He leaned forward and squinted his eyes.
Who's that?
He grumbled. I looked at Delilah. She raised her eyebrows at me and tilted her head toward my father, indicating that I should answer. It's me, Dad. Bonnie. I paused, waiting for him to answer or react in any way. He didn't. After an awkward moment, I cleared my throat and asked, how are you feeling?
Like dirt.
He sat back and returned his attention to the TV. With one shaking hand, he picked up the plastic fork on his tray, stabbed a sliver of lukewarm turkey, and shoved it into his mouth. Gravy dripped down his chin and onto his shirt. Bonnie's going to be helping you set your pills from now on, Delilah said, her voice raised to be heard over the shouting from the TV. Once I'm gone. My father took a swig of beer from his can, straining it through his teeth before swallowing it.
Mm-hmm.
His eyes remained fixed on the screen. I gave Delilah a pleading look. I should go. You hush, she replied. He'll be fine once he comes around. She tugged my sleeve toward the tiny kitchen. Let me show you the pills. For the next 15 minutes, Delilah went through the medication plan in scrupulous detail. Each pill was carefully portioned into a plastic box, sectioned by days of the week and parts of the day. Morning, noon, evening, and night. A system designed to ensure that the right pills were taken at the right times. The box had to be refilled every Sunday with enough pills for the week. All I had to do was follow the paper that indicated which meds went into which section. As long as I did that, Delilah explained, everything would be fine. I tried to concentrate on what she was saying, but I couldn't seem to focus. There was a noise coming from under the trailer, a sort of crunching sound that reminded me of someone chewing a mouthful of unpopped popcorn kernels. I imagined dozens of moles digging through the ground just under my feet, erupting into the night air in miniature explosions of mud and grass. I imagined their flat gray bodies, their wide pink hands, their long yellow claws. They were coming for me, coming to pull me through their tunnels and into their lair, where they would climb over me, hundreds of them, squirming blindly across my face, over my belly, through my hair, into my mouth. Hey! Delilah snapped her fingers in front of my face. Are you even listening to me? I blinked the nightmarish vision out of my head. Yeah, I nodded. Follow the paper. Got it. You don't even need to talk to him, if you don't want to," Delilah said, reassuringly. "You can just pop in, fill the pills, and pop out. Easy peasy." "And he knows what to take when?" Delilah nodded. "He's pretty good about it. Sometimes he forgets, but it's not the end of the world. We just don't want him to take too much. Hence, the box." She tapped one of her ragged fingernails against the plastic lid. "As long as everything in here is right, he'll be fine."
Bonnie!
My heart leapt into my throat at the sound of my father's voice shouting from the other room. Fear exploded in my chest. But then I remembered that I was a full-grown adult, and he was a shriveled old man. "There's nothing to be afraid of," I told myself. "He can't hurt you anymore." I poked my head out of the kitchen. "Yes, Dad?"
Come over here.
"Did you need something?"
Just come.
He held his hand out toward me, and I reluctantly crossed the stained carpet to his chair. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing, then took my hand in his.
How old are you?
45.
45.
He repeated. His grip tightened, the tip of his thumb prodding painfully at the fragile bones in the back of my hand. I made a small whimpering sound. Stop! I tried to pull my hand away, but his grip was shockingly strong for someone who looked so frail. His gaze returned to mine, his lips twisted into a smile, revealing teeth blackened with nicotine and decay.
Welcome home.
The screen door slammed behind me as I stormed out of the trailer and down the steps towards my car. Hot tears filled my eyes. Delilah followed me, rushing to catch up. Wait! No way. Forget it. I'm not fucking doing it. I stopped at my car and dug around in my purse, fumbling for my key fob while I continued ranting. I can't believe I let you talk me into coming back here. I flung my purse into the car, then climbed into the driver's seat. Delilah followed me, blocking the door from closing with her sizable frame. Move! I shouted. You can't go. The hell I can't. I'll run you over right here if you don't get out of my way. Then do it. Delilah glared down at me intensely. Fucking do it. I dare you. I closed my eyes, smacked the back of my skull against the headrest, and pounded my hands on top of the steering wheel. Fuck! I screamed. Fuck! 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 Oh, fucking hell. My heart thudded against my chest like a toddler kicking the back of an airplane seat during a tantrum. Delilah stared down at me with a smirk. You finished? I wiped the tears from my cheeks with my hands, then nodded. Delilah fished a set of keys from the purse dangling against her hip. Good. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to take this. She worked a key off of her key ring and held it out to me. You're going to show up here next Sunday and every Sunday after that. And you're going to set us pills. Got it? I took the key and nodded. Got it, I said quietly. And don't think I won't be checking in. Daddy might not be all there anymore, but he knows enough to tell me if you haven't been around. I sniffed and nodded again. Can I go now? I whispered. Sure can, Delilah said with faux cheeriness. She slammed my door with a thud. Drive safe! The road back to my apartment from my father's trailer was a long, lonely one. The majority of the 90-minute trip was spent navigating a winding 2-lane highway through the Pine Barrens. It had been 30 years since I had last traveled that route. 30 years since I ran from that trailer, hitched a ride from a farmer in an old Ford pickup, and never looked back. As I drove around the bend near where I had flagged down the Ford, a flash of color in the dark caused me to quickly shift my foot from the gas to the brake. A man in a reflective orange vest was standing in the middle of the road about 100 yards away. He raised a handheld stop sign and motioned my car over to the side of the highway. A few feet behind the man, giant hills of crumbled asphalt were piled across both lanes of the blacktop. At first, I was grateful that the guy had stopped me. If I had hit one of those piles at the speed I was going, my car probably would have gone airborne like something from a Michael Bay movie, tumbling end over end until it exploded in a ball of flames. It wasn't until I had already steered onto the narrow shoulder and rolled to a stop that I began to realize how risky it was for me to pull over. I was a woman, driving by myself, down a deserted highway in the middle of the night, in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere. I was completely and utterly alone. There were no workers, no construction vehicles, no traffic cones. Or lights, I realized. There are no goddamn lights. Nighttime construction was usually accompanied by a roaring generator powering giant floodlights that lit up the area like a football stadium. But in this case, the road was eerily quiet and completely dark. The only light, other than my headlights, came from a thin sliver of moon that was barely visible behind a thick bank of clouds. The man was working in near total darkness. The man's jaw churned as he chewed a thick wad of what I assumed to be tobacco. He spat a stream of dark saliva onto the ground, then lowered his stop sign and began trudging toward my car. He wore mud-streaked jeans and a filthy white t-shirt stretched taut over his protruding belly. The stubbled goatee around his mouth was pure black, an unnatural color that looked like he had dyed his facial hair with shoe polish. As the man drew closer, his features came in clearer focus. He had a round face with a flat, upturned nose that was almost pig-like in appearance. His eyes were black orbs, the pupils fully dilated in the darkness. What I first thought was a goatee was actually a thick smear of tar-black filth surrounding his mouth. It looked like he had gone bobbing for apples in a tub of used motor oil. I wondered if he knew how badly he had dirtied his face. He gave me what was intended to be a smile, but it was more like the expression of a terrified primate. Lips drawn back, teeth bared, gums exposed. I tried to suppress a gasp of horror at the sight. He had 2 overlong front teeth, with an equally overlong pair of teeth on the bottom, except for some large molars far in the back of his mouth. The rest of his teeth seemed to be missing. Watery black saliva slicked his gums. A drop spilled over his lip and dribbled down his chin, and he made no effort to wipe it away. A heavy lump of fear lodged in my throat as my unease escalated into actual concern. I had seen news reports about this. A man pretends to be a construction worker to get a woman to pull over. Then he and his accomplices break into the car to beat her and rob her. Or worse. Just to be safe, I locked the doors. Then I checked my mirrors to see if anyone was sneaking up from behind or beside the car. There was no one around. That didn't make me feel any better, though. Being alone with the guy on a dark road was somehow worse. The man stopped next to my car and rapped on my window with one knuckle. A quick, polite double tap, I lowered the glass an inch, just enough to hear him speak.
Sorry, ma'am.
He said.
Road's closed for tonight.
Something in his mouth crunched like he was chewing on ice cubes. He swallowed, then pursed his lips and spat another stream of dark liquid onto the road beside my car. Closed? Like, completely closed? It didn't make sense. I had traveled the road in the opposite direction just a few hours before, with no problem. Even if the construction had started after I passed, why had I been allowed back onto the road in the opposite direction? There should have at least been some signs warning of construction ahead. Had I missed them? Had I dozed off just long enough to pass them by without noticing?
Completely closed.
The man acknowledged.
I'm afraid you'll have to go back the way you came.
I can't do that. I have to get home. Okay, how long until it's fixed?
We've got a lot of work to do. It could be a while.
Who's we? I bent forward over the steering wheel, peering through the windshield into the darkness. Seems like it's just you. The man looked at me with a steady gaze.
Ma'am, it would be best if you went home.
I'm trying, I said, irritation creeping into my voice. My home's that way. I pointed down the road ahead of my car.
Not that home. Home.
A tense knot formed in my stomach as I narrowed my eyes and peered at the man's face. It looked vaguely familiar, but I wasn't sure why. Do I know you?
I don't believe so.
Then how do you know where my home is? The man let out an exasperated sigh. He spat again.
Look,
he said, his patience waning.
Go check your daddy's pills, okay? Make sure you've done them right.
My mouth suddenly felt bone dry, and I swallowed hard. My fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that I felt like it might bend in my hands. You know my father? I rasped.
No, ma'am. And I don't think I want to.
I stared at the man for a second, my brow knotted in confusion. He leaned closer to the window until his face was only inches from the glass. My muscles tensed. I shot a glance at the passenger side seat, looking for my purse. I had a can of pepper spray stashed in the front pocket, but it was too far out of reach for me to get to it easily. I considered hitting the accelerator and blowing past the man, but the state of the road made such a maneuver impossible. The piles of asphalt spanned both lanes from shoulder to shoulder. Each was at least 4 to 5 feet tall, and the highway was bordered on both sides by guardrails, leaving me no room to steer around the piles. The road was, for all intents and purposes, impassable. The man spoke again. His voice was almost a whisper.
He's not sorry,
he breathed. The stench of hot tar streamed into my car.
He'll never be sorry.
The truth of his words hit me in the gut like a cannonball. I felt a sob swell in my chest. My eyes burned with the sting of hot tears. At that moment, it didn't matter to me who the man was, or how he knew what he knew. All that mattered was that he was right. No, I agreed. My voice was barely audible. Never. The man straightened up, his tone returning to normal.
Go on back. Check his pills. Get him right this time.
Then he turned and headed down the road toward the construction site, calling over his shoulder at me as he walked.
The road will be clear once you do.
I sat in stunned silence, watching as the man picked up a piece of asphalt the size of a dinner roll from one of the piles, shoved it into his mouth, and began to chew. Even from a distance, I could hear the sickening crunch and grind of his teeth pulverizing the asphalt into grit. Pebbles of broken blacktop clung to his lips. Long tendrils of black spit spilled from the corners of his mouth and dripped down his chin like crude oil. The man swallowed, then picked up another piece of the road. As he lifted it to his lips, he seemed to sense that I was still watching him. He turned and smiled that grotesque smile, then lifted his hand in a silent goodbye. His palm was unnaturally wide, with short pink fingers tipped with long, curving yellowed claws, each as long as my index finger. They weren't the hands of a man. They were the hands of a mole. The sight of that horrific appendage finally spurred me into action. I swung the car in a wide U-turn, then stomped my foot on the gas. The tire spun on the pavement, spitting out a cloud of gravel and dust before catching hold of the road. As the car lurched forward, I risked one more look into the rearview mirror. The road behind me was illuminated in hellish shades of red by the taillights. But in the darkness, the man's pupils were as wide and black as the night itself. I stared vacantly at the road as I drove back up Route 322, my mind fully occupied with trying to comprehend what the fuck just happened. It was like a crazy hallucination, the kind of thing you experience in a dream and try to piece together into narrative after the fact. There was a construction worker, and he was eating the road. And then he told me about my father, and he had mole hands, and... I pushed the images out of my head and instead focused on where I was headed. Back to my father's trailer. I thought about the night I ran away. About the curl of my father's lip, the cruelty in his eyes, the smell of beer on his breath. About the bruises on my arms, my legs, my throat. About the smack of the screen door against the side of the trailer as I stumbled into the yard, bleeding from my broken mouth. About tripping over a huge molehill in my path, skinning my knees on the rough dirt before getting up and fleeing into the woods. I was only 15. Now, all I could think about were his pills. White pills, pink pills, yellow pills, green pills. I thought about how nervous I was while Delilah was explaining which pills were to be taken and when. I was nervous I would get it wrong, nervous about what would happen to my father if I had made a mistake. He was half blind with cataracts. He couldn't even see the pills he was taking. He just popped them into his mouth and swallowed them without a second thought. If I messed up, he wouldn't know until it was too late. The yellow pills were the painkillers. Opioids. Delilah said to give him one in the morning and one at night. Any more than that, and he could get addicted. He could overdose. He could die. When I finally arrived back at the trailer, I let myself in with the key Delilah had given me. The smell of stale beer and fresh urine attacked my nostrils as I entered. I could hear my father's ripsaw snoring coming from his bedroom. The words of the construction worker echoed in my head as I closed the door quietly behind me. Go on back. Check his pills. Get him right this time. Using the dim glow of my smartphone screen to light my way, I crept into his kitchen and opened the cabinet where the pills were stored. I flipped open each of the little plastic lids on the pill case, one for each part of each day. The pills were portioned exactly as Delilah had instructed, including the opioids. 1 in the morning, 1 at night, just like the doctor prescribed. I looked up at the cabinet containing the assortment of pill bottles. The opioids were in the front, right where Delilah had left them. I twisted off the cap and poured a handful into my palm. Then I picked up the pill box, dumped the other pills into the trash, and replaced them with as many yellow pills as the box could hold. There were no construction signs on the drive back from my father's place to my apartment. I hadn't missed them. I hadn't dozed. They simply didn't exist. There was no construction. There were no piles of broken asphalt blocking the lanes. The road to home, my home, was open and clear, just like the man had promised. I drove at a relaxed pace through the forest. As I passed the stretch of highway where the construction worker had stopped me, my thoughts again turned to the night I ran away. I thought about the freezing December air biting into my tear-streaked face as I sprinted through the woods, muscles spasming and teeth chattering. I wanted to keep running, but the cold was too much. Eventually, I gave up. Sitting against the snow-covered trunk of a fallen tree, I closed my eyes and drifted off into unconsciousness. Sometime later, I awoke in total darkness, certain that I had died. I was covered in dirt, buried in a layer of warm earth and a heavy blanket of leaves. I reached out my hands, feeling more dirt a foot or so above my head. A hail of loose earth dropped onto my face as I scraped my nails against the soil. I was in a grave, I thought. A shallow grave. But I wasn't dead. I was awake. I was alive. I rolled over onto my stomach and lifted my head. A dim shaft of light was streaming through the dirt in front of me. That's when I realized that I wasn't in a grave. I was in a tunnel. Belly crawling toward the light, I broke through a loose wall of earth and emerged onto an embankment beside Route 322. Once my eyes adjusted to the glare of the morning sun, I scrambled up the embankment to the shoulder of the highway and flagged down a passing truck for a ride. I climbed into the truck and closed my eyes, still wondering how I had ended up in the tunnel. I had no recollection of what happened after I passed out, but I was sure that the shelter, along with the heat-preserving cover of dirt and leaves, had saved me from freezing to death overnight. I was also sure that I hadn't crawled in there myself. The thought should have been scary, but it wasn't. I didn't feel afraid. I felt loved, cared for, protected. As the truck pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the tunnel one last time, and my breath caught in my throat. Staring back at me from deep in the shadows was a pair of eyes as wide and black as the night itself.
Ever since my wife Adeline disappeared, it's been just Charlie and me all alone. I don't mind it. I never cared much for company. If I'd wanted visitors, I wouldn't have tried to get as far away from civilization as I could now, would I? Charlie's pit stops back at the house for food, sleep, and depositing the presents he sometimes brings back. That's enough for me. In the meanwhile, I occupy my time with books and occasionally television. Adeline left behind more than her fair share of the former. She had a thing for mystery novels. I never used to take any interest in them, but nowadays, well, I suppose reading the ones I knew she enjoyed lets me feel closer to her again. My daughter says I'm going crazy up here. I tell her that I've never been happier. I don't want to go back to the city and rot away in some old folks' home with a condescending nurse talking to me like I'm a child. I'm 85 and I'm as sharp as I ever was. Not quite as spry, no. But if anything really needs fixing, I have a telephone and I have the internet. I can call for help if I need it. I intend to live my days out here in the house, with the woods stretching endlessly on behind me. I breathe fresh air, relax in solitude, and wait for the Lord to tell me that my time is done. Until then, I will do all I can to enjoy the time I have left on my terms. Of course, that said, my daughter Sarah still worries after me more than she ought to. I suppose I should find it sweet, but really it's a little annoying. I love her dearly, and I'm glad we raised her right, yada yada. But when I'm trying to read, I don't need her knocking on my door to fuss over me. I'm sitting in my chair on the porch. I have a coffee and a sandwich. I'm not going anywhere, and even if I was, I'm hardly feeble. Regardless, she insists that I need the company. I gave up fighting her on that. I figure she's doing it more for her own peace of mind than anything else. I was never there for my father in his twilight years. He and I weren't on speaking terms, and after he passed, well, I suppose I'd wished one of us had had the balls to say one last nice thing. And I suppose I wished that it had been me. And besides, sometimes she brings me gifts. Not quite as fancy as the ones Charlie sometimes brings, but fancy in their own way. Cameras to monitor the outside so I can see who's coming from my tablet computer. And I suppose the tablet computer herself. I've adapted well enough to use it, I suppose. I'd like to think I've done so better than most my age, and if I'm being honest, I like how easy the technology has made some things, even if they were things I didn't really ask for in the first place. The other day, Sarah asked me if Charlie's long absences had bothered me. I told her they didn't. Charlie's always been an outdoor cat. He's as much a creature of the forest as the birds and the squirrels. Adeline used to worry after him, since there were coyotes and bears out there, but I don't. I reckon that if Charlie's made it this long without running into trouble, he knows what he's doing, and judging by the things he sometimes brought home, I got the impression he wasn't exactly in danger. It wasn't often, but every now and then, when Charlie came back, he'd have some sort of trinket with him. Sometimes it was junk, bottle caps, pieces of old cans and whatnot. Sometimes he'd have coins, usually just small change. But every now and then, he'd have something a little more valuable, jewelry and whatnot. Some of it was fake. A few pieces looked pretty real. I always kept the real-looking ones in a drawer in case anyone ever came looking for them. It didn't seem right to sell them. I figured that they probably had been dropped somewhere in the woods by hikers, and Charlie had found them. Either that, or he was raiding some kind of garbage pile. It's hard to say for sure. Regardless, I got the vibe that he was staying out of trouble. Some cats are dumb. Charlie isn't. I've got more faith in that cat than I've had in most people. Still, Sarah had to ask her questions. "Don't you wonder where he's going at all?" she asked. I got the impression that she asked more out of genuine curiosity than anything else, and that told me she was trying to work her way up to, towards some kind of point. "What that cat does is his business," I said. "And you're not in the least bit curious, huh? All right, what'd you buy?" The sales pitch was getting a little annoying, and Sarah just smiled sheepishly. "Okay, well, I just thought it might be fun, But they've got these cameras. People wear them when biking and stuff. You can attach them right to your body. Isn't that neat?" "I suppose. I didn't really see the point to it, but I was playing along. It might be cool. It'll give you something to look at when he gets back." Truth be told, I thought the whole idea was a little stupid. But she had gotten my attention, I suppose. Something in my gut told me that this was the sort of question that was going to keep me up. Besides, Sarah seemed pretty interested in it, and as much as my daughter can annoy me sometimes, I've never been once able to say no to my little girl, and I wasn't about to start to now. Now that she'd hit 50. I suppose, I repeated. Charlie put up with the ridiculous sweaters your mother always used to put on him around Christmas time. He'll probably tolerate this too, and I don't imagine it'll do him any harm. Oh, it won't, trust me. This'll be fun, I promise. I could hear the years melting away in her voice, and beneath the lines of age and gray at her temples, I could see that same 2-year-old I'd not so begrudgingly sat and had imaginary tea with once upon a time. She split into a full grin and reached into her purse to take out the camera, which looked like a small gray box. She'd even bought a harness. The kids are going to love this, too. They always ask about you and Charlie, you know. Oh, I'm sure they do, I replied. The kids must have been at least pushing 20 by now. I doubt they spared much thought toward what I was up to. But it was nice of her to lie to me, I guess. Looking at that harness and camera, the first thing that came to mind was, Charlie is not going to be happy about this. But I kept that thought to myself. Aside from moderately annoying the poor cat a little bit, the whole idea seemed harmless enough. Besides, maybe we'd actually see something interesting when we'd look back at the footage. Sarah, of course, showed me how to set everything up. She showed me how to access the video by myself, and I'd say I got the hang of it moderately quickly. I knew the steps at least, and if I got stuck, I could always call her. Then, after chatting a while longer, she went home and let me return to my solitude. Charlie hadn't come home yet, although he usually didn't show up until sundown, so I set everything aside and sat down to read a book, and at some point I fell asleep in my chair. When I woke up, it was dawn, and I could see Charlie sitting on the banister of the porch right outside the window, so I'd know he was there when I woke up. As soon as he saw me moving, he started mewling and pacing around. I picked myself up, stretched, and shuffled over to the door to let him in. He scurried indoors and went straight to the food bowl, and as he did, I noticed that he'd left me something on the deck. It gleamed brightly in the morning sun, and I slowly bent down to pick it up. It was a necklace. Judging by the tarnish of it, it was real silver. The chain looked broken, but the charm looked all right. It depicted a little heart. Nothing fancy, but it was something good for a lady, I suppose. No engravings on it. No sign of who it belonged to. It was likely that nobody would come looking for this, but I still took it to the sink to wash it off before I put it in the drawer with the rest. That drawer rattled with old rings, necklaces, earrings, and rare coins that Charlie had brought over the years. The old cat himself was going to town on his dry food bowl, as if he'd never seen food before in his life. I honestly felt a little bad for him and hoped he hadn't been waiting too long. I went to fetch some wet food for him, partially as an apology, and partially because I knew he'd start to get mouthy with me if I didn't give him a proper breakfast. I was too tired to listen to that old man bitch. Charlie's a good cat, despite his attitude. He's a graying Maine coon with a mean face, although he always melted like butter in Adeline's hands. She was always inclined to baby him, but I always saw him as a fellow curmudgeon to pass the days with. I never actually told anyone this, but I always imagined he'd be a bit of a southern drawl if he could talk, and that he'd sound a little bit like John Wayne. As soon as he heard me opening up the wet food, he was right at my ankles, expectantly mewing and demanding his breakfast. I figured it wasn't wise to keep him waiting. I set the bowl down on the kitchen table and let him jump up to eat his fill while I started on my own breakfast. Charlie had a nap while I ate, sleeping in the armchair Adeline had once liked to sit in. I didn't bother him until around noon, when I remembered that camera that Sarah had brought. I'd left it in the living room, and while I hadn't put too much thought into putting it on Charlie, the memory of the necklace I'd found that morning had gotten me thinking. Where was my old friend getting all that junk? Was he finding it? Stealing it? What? I suppose the camera was likely to answer that. Sarah had already piqued my curiosity as to where he went, but that posed a question that required a more immediate answer. Charlie was out cold with that contented look cats have when they sleep, and he paid me no mind as I got up to fetch the camera. I read over the instructions again and played with it for a bit before I actually tried to set it up. I recorded a little snippet of footage of Charlie napping there on the couch, popped that into my computer to review. The quality of the camera seemed fairly nice. It was easy enough to access the files. Might we, go and make sure the harness fits? Charlie only gave some slight protest. When I bothered to put him in the harness, I'd committed the sin of awakening him, although he gave me a pass despite clearly being grumpy. "Sorry, old-timer," I said, before scratching him under his chin. I fastened the harness around him, then fitted the camera onto the chest. "Guess I'll be along for your next adventure, huh?" He just chirped at me and sniffed my fingers, then flopped back down to continue his rest. He didn't stay that way for long. Within the next 10 minutes or so, he was at the back door stretching and pacing, ready to set out on the road again. I checked to make sure his camera was on before setting him loose. "Happy trails, Pilgrim," I said under my breath as he scampered outside and bounded down the stairs. He stopped to look back at me briefly before he took off into the forest, and I knew I probably wouldn't see him again until nightfall. Normally, I'd have been in bed by 9, considering I was up so early. But thinking about Charlie and what I'd find on his camera kept me up, and I couldn't help but feel the house was a little too quiet for a change. I put the TV on to try and distract myself, since reading hadn't quite done the trick. I poured myself a hard drink as well. No harm in that, I figured. It had been a while since I'd indulged, not since Adeline's funeral. We buried an empty casket. There hadn't been a body. After 2 months of looking, there wasn't much point in pretending as if she was ever going to come back. My mind stayed sharp over the years. Adeline wasn't quite as lucky. Dementia ran in her family. We'd seen it happen to her mother, a slow, cruel decline. We both feared for years that would have happened to her, too. Then, when we started seeing the signs, neither of us acknowledged it, even when they became too large to ignore. Sarah was over constantly back then, doing what she could to help out. Adeline was a strong-willed woman up until the end, though. Sarah suggested retirement homes. Neither of us wanted to go. She wasn't feeble. She and I had taken care of ourselves. We'd kept our health into our old age. We even went on walks through the trails out behind the house, going into some home where they'd infantilize or treat her as if she was less of a person just because she was old and sick. Take her out of the home she'd known for years. I couldn't do that to her. I didn't want to watch her go through that. I would be damned if I'd let her go without me. No, she was my wife, in sickness and in health until death do us part. Those were the vows, and I would honor them until death. Death. When I was a young man, in my 20s, and looking to propose, the prospect of growing old together terrified me. I wouldn't give back the memories we made together, not for anything. But back then, the idea of one day losing her, or of knowing the pain she might feel if she lost me, that thought would sometimes creep into the back of my mind. I'd always banish it, dismissing it, as something to worry about in the future. Then one morning, I woke up to find the spot in the bed beside me empty, when I never saw her again. Then I had to accept that eventuality had come. The police suggested that she'd gone on a hike alone. She'd done that before when we were younger. I didn't argue with them. I imagine that's just what she did. She woke up, forgetting the years that had passed, looked out into the crisp morning air and decided to enjoy it. She'd walked out, and she never came back in. Maybe she'd forgotten the trail, got turned around, and wandered deeper into the woods. Maybe she'd fallen, hurt herself, and never been found. Whatever ending had befallen her, I preferred not to think about it. It was better that I didn't know, even if not knowing was the cruelest thing in the world. Sarah was there for me, of course. I suppose that's why she doted on me so much in the year or so since. I wonder if deep down she fears that one day I'll follow Adeline into the woods and she'll never see me again either. The scotch sat in my hand as I stared blankly at the TV, not really watching the infomercial on the screen. A flash of movement from the corner of my eye drew my attention and tore me away from my thoughts. Charlie paced on the back porch outside. The camera harness on him looked unharmed. I set my glass down and stood up to let him in. "Have a nice adventure, old-timer?" I asked. He just went straight for his food bowl. Dinner time. I let him gorge himself on dry food while I got a tin of wet food for him. That got his attention, and he hopped up onto the kitchen table to await his feast. "You're a spoiled cat, aren't you?" I asked. I'll bet if he could have responded, he'd have said something like, "You bet your ass, Pilgrim." As he ate, I took the camera off his chest and undid the harness. He seemed happy to have it off. The camera was a little dirtier and had stopped recording some time ago. I vaguely recalled Sarah said something about the camera not having a hell of a lot of battery life. A couple of hours or something. I probably wouldn't have gotten the full adventure, but that was fine by me. I doubt I'd have missed anything that interesting. I was tired and wanted to sleep, but the camera called to me. I can't quite explain the sense of urgency I felt about looking at that footage. Maybe I was more bored with my routine than I thought, and at the very least, the footage might be somewhat interesting. I gave Charlie a pat on the head before deciding a cup of tea might give me the boost I needed to go through that footage. When all was said and done, Charlie had gotten comfortable in his favorite chair, and I retired with my hot tea to the office. I plugged the camera into my computer and took a sip of my drink. There were only a couple of videos stored in the camera. I recognized a few as the test videos I'd taken by the thumbnails. The last one, though, it must have taken its thumbnail from a random point in the video. It looked almost pitch black, as if something were obscuring the camera. I frowned at the sight of it and hoped like hell the file wasn't messed up somehow. I'd have needed to call Sarah if it was, and who knew when she could make it out to see me. I clicked the video anyway just to see what happened. I didn't expect it to start, but it did. I could see part of Charlie's head and my own jean-clad legs as I turned the camera on. I remembered this. This was just about before I let him out. "Happy trails, Pilgrim," I heard myself say, before the back door opened and Charlie was set loose upon the forest. What followed was some rather neat-looking footage as Charlie skulked around some bushes and some tall grass, but I can't really say it was all that interesting. He climbed some fallen branches and made his way into one of the neighbors' yards. He watched them for a little while, and even ate some treats they had left out for him that seemed to be for him. And a little glutton. Then he went back off into the woods. I'm sure at one point I saw him pass the hiking trail that Adeline and I used to walk. I recognized the little creek that he walked along as he moved deeper into the forest. There was a familiar rustle of grass and water as he walked along, although the sound quickly became annoying, so I lowered the volume. I couldn't help but wonder just where the hell he was going out there, but I imagined he was probably just hunting. Maybe he'd kill a mouse or something. The canopy above him seemed to get a few shades darker as he climbed up onto a fallen birch tree. The loose bark crinkled under his paws. The tree seemed to lead up to another, taller tree. The canopy above was thick enough that it almost seemed like a nighttime, despite it still being fairly early in the day. Looking at the timestamp of the video, he'd only been out for an hour and a bit. He moved along the branch of the taller tree, walking as if he knew where he was going. I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of something ahead of him. At a glance, it looked a bit like a bird's nest, although it seemed rather large. That said, I knew some birds liked large nests. The longer I watched, the more glimpses I caught of the thing. There was definitely a nest of some sort. Twigs and leaves had been deliberately put together to form something, although this was bigger than any bird's nest I'd ever seen before. It seemed to completely dominate the top of one tree, and Charlie kept climbing as if he hadn't quite reached the top yet. Hell, I couldn't even see the sides of this thing. It seemed less like a nest, and more like a wall of branches that seemed too big and too thick for a regular bird to lift. After a while, one of the branches that Charlie had climbed seemed to turn toward the nest. Getting closer, I could have sworn I saw bits of rope holding some of the larger sticks, or perhaps it would be more apt to call them branches together. I didn't get that good of a look, though. Charlie seemed to weave his way through a gap in the nest, creeping in as if he owned the place. The inside seemed pitch black. Charlie moved slowly, carefully choosing each step as he drew closer. It was over a minute until there was any light again, long enough to make me check to see if the video had ended, but there was still about a half hour left. At last, he seemed to emerge onto the other side of whatever wall he'd just passed through. The light inside the nest was scarce. The interior was scattered with large black feathers, and I could see the sunlight glinting off bits of shiny things. Tin cans, children's toys, pocket watches, hood ornaments, jewelry. Was this where he was getting all that? What the hell was this? Some kind of massive crow's nest? I was hardly an expert on crows, but I couldn't imagine they'd ever make a nest that large. Charlie paused as if looking or listening for something before he continued. He paused to sniff a few pieces of discarded junk before casually making his way over to the far side of the nest. As he walked, I noticed the shape of things that didn't quite look like branches or sticks. They were brownish in color and seemed to blend in easily, but the shape of them was all wrong. Branches don't have those smooth edges. Branches don't curve inwards on themselves. And branches don't have eye sockets. I could see the skull of some sort of animal, a large rodent of some kind staring emptily into the interwoven branches. I could see bones with smaller twigs wrapped around them, used almost as additional support for the structure of the nest. And as Charlie walked, I saw something that made my heart begin to beat faster as a sick sensation filled my stomach. I've seen human skulls on TV, but never in real life. Had it not been for the matted black hair that still clung to the scalp, I might have been able to dismiss the idea that it was anyone else. But I knew that hair. I kissed that head 1,000 times over a lifetime together. I remembered the laughing eyes in those now empty sockets. Even in death, I recognized my Adeline. Or what was left of my Adeline. How many of her bones had been added to this nest? Her body alone couldn't have been what became its foundation. How many others had been claimed as construction materials for this nest? Oh, God. Oh, dear God. Charlie sat reverently before Adeline's skull, and I knew that he recognized her, too. He almost certainly come there to mourn, to pay his respects, or simply to be with her, even if she was long gone. I could only pray that whatever had done this to her had only taken her after she died. But from the gashes in the bone, I feared that wasn't the case. But what could have done something like this? What could have taken her? What could have... Charlie had been sitting quietly for almost 10 minutes as I placed my hands to my mouth, stifling my own cries of grief. Then he moved, suddenly, as if something had startled him. From the speakers, I heard a raspy sound, an inhuman hiss that sounded like a cross between a sadistic cackle and the chattering of some large bird. Charlie scurried out of sight, moving between another gap in the branches of the nest before positioning himself to look back. Through the gaps in the branches and bones, I could see something else that had entered the nest, although I could see not fully what it was. All I could see was 2 scaled legs that each ended with a 4-toed claw, just like a bird of prey. It chittered and cackled as it approached the spot where Charlie had been, moving awkwardly as it hopped closer. I could see long black feathers trailing down from the creature's body as it continued to chitter. It seemed to inspect the spot where Charlie had been, and I heard him hiss. It didn't do much to deter the creature that was hunting for him, the creature that had likely killed my wife. I could hear the rustling of sticks, and the camera blurred as Charlie moved again to crawl out of the nest. He moved through the gaps in the branches as if he'd done this 1,000 times, and found his way onto a long branch that led down. Then he ran for freedom, and the very last shot I saw in that video was the blur of the ground beneath him. As the video ended, I couldn't help but notice Charlie in the doorway of my office. His eyes were wide and alert. His ears were raised as if the sounds of whatever creature he'd encountered had frightened him. With a shaking hand, I coaxed him over to me, and he jumped up onto my desk. I'm not sure if he was there to protect me or if he wanted me to protect him. Either way, I was glad to have his company. I pulled the old man into my lap to hold him tight, and it took a few minutes before he seemed to relax again. Lucky cat. I don't think I'll ever be able to relax again. I've rewatched the footage countless times by now. I haven't told Sarah anything. When she asked if I'd put the camera on Charlie yet, I told her I'd get around to it. She could never see what I've seen. She could never know what happened to her mother, never. But I'm not foolish enough to delete that footage. If ever proof is needed, it needs to be accessible to Sarah or to anyone else who may need it, should I not return from the woods today. I haven't hunted in years, but I dusted off my old rifle from the garage. It still works fine, and I've got bullets. I don't know if I'm half the shot I used to be. It's one thing to hit a few cans out in the backyard. It's another to hit a moving target, but I'm sure I'll manage one way or another. I'm sure I can follow the path that Charlie took. Not exactly, but close enough. I'm sure that if I go out into the woods, I can find the nest. I can find whatever horrible thing lives there. And when I do, by God, I will kill it. For Adeline. For Adeline.
Bert set his drink down on the end table beside his recliner and stared towards the window. Without looking, he lifted the remote and muted the television. He thought he heard movement on the porch. It had happened before and turned out to be a raccoon or a possum. Not many people come by out here in the middle of the woods, and that was exactly the point. Bert was an introvert, to put it mildly, and being in a residential neighborhood, even a quiet one, felt like too much. People always felt inclined to show up at your door, banging and ringing and demanding attention. They wanted to sell you things or convert you to their religion or get you to join their church or find out where someone else lived or any manner of other thing. Bert found a house that was close enough to the real world that he could join it when he needed to, and far enough away that people didn't care to venture there just to sell you a vacuum or ask you if you've read the book in their hand. Now, if he talked to someone, it was his own choice, and one he rarely made. Every time he heard something on the porch, it activated his anxiety. Silently, he begged for it not to be a human being. Bert heard the sound again more clearly now that the TV wasn't blasting a heartfelt cop drama. It sounded like footfalls far too big to be a critter like those he was used to. Maybe it's a bear, he thought. He supposed it could be any manner of thing out here. What if it's Bigfoot? He's clearly an introvert too. We should be able to share these woods just fine. Bert stood slowly and bent over, trying to get a look out the window, but the curtains he put in to block the view from outside were now working against him. He bit his lip and quietly grumbled. He crept towards the door, stopping to listen every few steps. It was quiet now, and he was beginning to wonder if maybe his mind had been playing tricks on him. Then he heard it again. There was definitely someone out there. Why? Why would they come up the long, steep gravel drive through the woods and bother me? What could they possibly want? Bert wanted to scream, "Go away, not interested." But if he did, then they would know for sure he was home and he wouldn't be able to hide out of sight until they went away. He moved to the window and tried to gently move the curtain so he could peer out without being too obvious. He couldn't see anyone, so he stood there, listening. His breath quickened and his heart raced. He started to chew on his fingernail. Bert knew they hadn't left because he would have heard them. Their footsteps were pounding on his porch, and he never heard them walk off of it. Shoo! Go! Get! Bert stepped as quietly as he could and made his way to a different window where he peered out the curtain just the same. He still couldn't see well, but he saw enough to know that he had been right. From where he was, he could see a sleeve and a hand. It looked like a masculine hand from his best guess. Bert's fingers started drumming on his lips. Not hairy enough to be Bigfoot. Too bad. Something banged against the door and Bert jumped. His eyes went wide. Had they just knocked extraordinarily hard, or was the man on the porch actually trying to get in? Bert didn't know if he should try to say something to let them know that someone lived here, or if he should go hide somewhere. Could whoever they are think that this house was abandoned? It didn't look abandoned. It was clean and tidy, and there was a car in the garage that he had admittedly rarely used, but it was there nonetheless. There were curtains on the windows and lights on, and moments ago a television was playing loudly. Surely they know someone is living here? Is this a home invasion? The bang came again and Bert jumped. He didn't know what to do and he started pacing. He could call the police despite how little he wanted to talk to them, but even if he did, it would take them 30 minutes on a good day to get there and he could be dead by then. Maybe the person on the porch wouldn't know that, and he could convince them that the police were on the way. If they were up to something illegal, that might be enough to scare them away. Should I yell? I should yell. Bert wanted to make sure he could protect himself if the plan went awry before he tried speaking, so he hurried to the kitchen for a knife. As he did, the person threw their weight into his front door again, and Bert cringed and twitched. His head was tucked down between his shoulders now. He grabbed a steak knife and scurried back into the other room, jumping again as the door was once again hit from the other side. "Whoever you are," Bert said, trying his best to sound far more confident than he was, "I've called the police, so you should go now. I don't know what you want, but the cops will be here any minute." "I didn't know anyone was in there," a voice said from the other side of the door, confirming Bert's suspicions that the stranger was a man. "Do this the easy way, and just let me in." Bert's mouth fell open and he shook his head. He licked his lips. His mouth felt uncomfortably dry. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't want you to come in. You need to leave." The door banged again and Bert bit down on his own hand to keep from screaming. "The cops are coming. Do you want to go to jail?" Bert hoped that he didn't sound as afraid to the man outside as he did to himself. He gasped when the window beside the door shattered inward and scattered glass shards all over the floor. He watched in absolute terror as an arm came through and felt for the door lock. Bert watched the masculine hand with a star-shaped scar by the thumb feeling around bore away to gain entry. He felt frozen, rooted to the ground. He couldn't even understand how this could be happening. "I should be safe out here. It's called off the beaten path for a reason." Then it occurred to him that he held a knife. With a deep breath and a nod of confidence, Bert ran forward and sliced at the hand coming through his window. The blade was serrated and dug in with its silver teeth, pulling and tearing the flesh. The man outside cursed but continued his efforts. Bert cringed as he stared at the bleeding hand, grasping at his doorknob through the crackle of broken glass. His own hands tensed like claws and scratched at the air. He couldn't breathe. "Who the hell are you?" Bert tried again. He stabbed at the hand this time, pushing the jagged blade through the meat and bone and tacking it to the door with a wet thunk. His eyes widened in panic. That wasn't going to get rid of the person on the porch. I just attached them to my house. I don't want them attached to my house. I want them gone. damn it! Just open the door. That really hurt, the voice from outside commanded. No, Bert called back. He struggled to pull the knife free as it seemed to be caught on a bone or tendon, and his stomach spasmed with the threat of vomiting as the blood shot out in his direction upon its eventual release. He made a gagging sound and backed up a step as the man on the other side of the door issued a growl. Go away! The wounded hand retracted and Bert sighed with relief, though he was still trembling. That's right. Go. He stood there and listened intently. Bert almost cried when he failed to hear any retreating footsteps heading away from his own. Why won't he leave? I just stabbed you, for God's sake. Go away. The door banged again and again. It kept going now, in all-out assault. Bert backed up until he bumped into his recliner and fell backwards over it. He landed half on and half off the cushion and slid to the floor just as the door came crashing inward. Bert didn't hold the scream back this time as the man stepped over the threshold into his house. The guy looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was thin and tall, lanky, with long platinum blonde hair and a zip-up hooded sweatshirt. He wore jeans and work boots, and his hand was still bleeding in thin streams that were staining Bert's carpet. He raised a single eyebrow and looked at Bert strangely when he saw him there on the floor beside his recliner. "What do you want?" Bert asked him. The stranger sighed. "Right now, I want you to use that recliner to block the new broken door before the people trying to kill me get here and walk their happy asses in here unattested." Bert scratched at his neck and face. "There are more people coming? Here? Why?" He shook his head. This wasn't supposed to be happening. It shouldn't be happening. Why is this happening? Fine, I'll do it myself, the stranger said. He grabbed the recliner and started dragging it across the carpeted floor. Bert jumped away and scurried across the floor on all fours. He reached the far wall and leaned his back against it. He pulled his knees up to his chest and watched as this person he had never met before angled the recliner and jammed it under the doorknob. "Do you have any duct tape?" the man asked Bert. "I need it for my hand that you so kindly stabbed, and it would be a good idea to use something to patch up this window. At least slow them down for a second." Bert looked up at the man in disbelief. "You just forced your way into my house." The stranger threw his arms up. "What did you want me to do? Wait for an invitation? I didn't really have time for that. Now, come on, duct tape?" Bert blinked a few times. "There's a toolbox above the washer to the left just off the kitchen," he said solemnly. "There should be some in there. Please don't use it on me. God, please don't let him use it on me." "Fantastic," the man said. "Why don't you stand up and guard that door again? You could stab the actual bad guys when they show up." He didn't wait for a response before marching through the house to follow the directions Bert had given him. Actual bad guys? So who the hell is he? The good guy? Bert couldn't breathe. He felt like someone was standing on his chest. This was a nightmare. He couldn't believe it was happening, but he did force himself to get to his feet, and he stared at the blood-stained door waiting for it to jostle with another bang of someone trying to get in. Will that recliner really hold them? Should I add something to it? The man returned from the kitchen with his hand wrapped in silver. He was carrying the roll of tape and Bert's baking sheet pans. Bert watched in horrified silence as the man taped the metal pans over the broken window. He listened to the sound of the tape stretching and tearing over and over like a screeching bird. "Who are you?" Bert asked when he could find his voice. "Tolliver," he said. He left the silver-coated window and crossed the room to stare into the wall mirror. "Jesus, I look terrible," he said, tugging at the skin beneath his eyes. "I should have checked myself while I was in your kitchen, but I was too focused on getting this place defended. Do you have any raw meat, steaks, or anything like that? The bloodier, the better." Bert slowly shook his head from side to side. No, I'm a vegetarian. Guess you broke into the wrong house, jerk. Tolliver groaned. Of course you are. My luck is just awful. Sorry, Bert said, and he couldn't believe he was saying it. He just wanted this man to leave his house. There may be some cold pizza in the fridge that you could heat up in the microwave. Take it. Have all of it. Tolliver exhaled with a huff. Well, it won't help anything, but it certainly won't hurt anything either. Who doesn't love pizza? Bert watched as the man walked by him and briskly made his way to the kitchen. He came back a moment later with a slice of pizza that he hadn't bothered to microwave. He took a bite and wiped the grease off of his mouth with the back of his hand. Is this garlic Parmesan Alfredo? It's fantastic. I love garlic. Me too, Bert said, not knowing what else to say. What do you want from me? Tolliver threw his pizza crust on the ground. I want you to get up and help me fortify this place so we can both survive the night. Do you think you can do that? Bert eyed the crust on the floor and then looked up at the man that had broken into his home. No. No? I am out here because I don't like people. I don't like conversations and interactions. It causes me anxiety, and you broke into my house, forced your way in, and are bringing more people here. I'm not going anywhere. Tolliver stared down at him with stern, angry eyes. Listen, not if, but when the people chasing me get here, if we can't keep them out, you're going to die. Bert glared back. Why? Why me? I just want to be left alone. Why can't I do that? Wrong place, wrong time, wrong dietary choices, Tolliver said. He started walking around and checking the locks on the windows. Bert didn't understand the dietary comment, and he didn't care. He just wanted this to be over. He wanted to ask if he could just leave and let this man have his house, but he knew Tolliver would want to leave with him. It seemed the intruder didn't realize Bert had a car as of yet. If he played his cards right, maybe he could get to it without Tolliver realizing. Sighing, Bert got to his feet. Tell me what to do. Tolliver was heading back towards the kitchen, and he stopped and looked back at Bert. If you have a gun, get it. I'm getting the rest of your tools. Maybe we can nail the windows shut or fix that door before they show up. Bert snorted. If I had a gun, do you think I would have tried to bite you off with a steak knife? In my circle, it would make sense, but fine. Just keep an eye out for people and call me if you see anyone coming. Bert didn't respond. He watched Tolliver stomp off, and then he went to the door as asked, but he had his own ideas. Bert did his best to be quiet as he tugged the recliner out from under the doorknob. He eased it onto the floor and then looked over his shoulder, checking for Tolliver. When he didn't see him, he gently turned the knob and opened the door, cringing when it squealed and doing his best not to think about the other man's blood that had coated the knob and was now greasing his palm. Once it was open, Bert threw caution to the wind and ran out onto the porch, down the steps and around the drive for the garage. There was someone standing by the door. They wore a button-down shirt with a western bolo tie, black jeans and matching boots, and a cowboy hat. Bert's eyes widened and he skidded to a halt. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. The man took notice of him and started his way. Bert gasped and spun on his heel. Two more men, both in long overcoats and hats that shadowed their faces, were making their way up the drive towards him. No. Bert didn't know what to do. If he went back inside, he would be safe from these people for the time being, but he would be stuck in there with the madman that broke his door and invaded his home. If he tried to get past the man by his garage, he could fail and die, but if he succeeded, he could get to the car. It seemed the better option. A voice drew his attention, and Bert turned with a start to find a woman clad in black with equally dark hair tied in a ponytail standing nearby, leaning on a tree with one arm. Where is it? Is it inside? she said to him. It? What? Am I supposed to know what she's talking about? There were too many of them. It felt like they were everywhere. How many more were out there in the trees or still coming? Bert couldn't breathe. His eye caught a glint of something at the woman's hip and he looked that way. There was a long blade hanging from a leather strap attached to her belt. These people were armed. Tolliver was right. He was going to die today. I wish I knew why. Answer the question, the man by the garage said, walking his way. Is it in the house? Bert was trembling. This was too many people, too fast, too much danger and stress, just too much. His eyes danced between them all. Then he made his decision and he turned and ran away from them, charging back up the steps and into the house. He slammed the door and hurried to wedge the recliner back in place. Bert felt before he saw that Tolliver was staring at him. When he turned and actually did gaze upon the other man, he thought, he looks pissed. Bert frowned. They're here, he said. At least 4 of them. Maybe more. Probably more. I don't know. Move, Tolliver told him. There was no time to fix the door, so he tried to seal it with the remainder of the roll of duct tape. Why are they after you? Bert asked from behind him. What did you do? Tolliver laughed but didn't look back at him. Do? I existed. That's what I did. Even in 2022, some people are not so open-minded and progressive as we'd like to believe. I think they called you it, Bert said. I'm sure they did. That's precisely my point. Do you have any other weapons than the steak knives in this house? You're in the woods for God's sake. Don't you need weapons? Again, vegetarian. I don't hunt or hurt animals. Tolliver slapped himself in the forehead. He rubbed at his eyes. I'm just trying to make sure that neither of us dies here tonight. You don't have a wood-cutting axe or something? Anything I could use. A little help. Help I can't give, Bert said with obvious frustration. You have my kitchen knives and my hammer. That's what I've got. I don't plan for home invasions. We know you're in there, a voice called from outside. Tolliver growled and Bert curled in on himself. Bert wondered if he was inside his house with the good guy or the bad guy in this situation. His teeth looked sharp just now, like he filed them or something. Please be the good guy. You've got to have something, Tolliver said. You don't have a baseball bat? Do I seem like someone who plays baseball? I want to be alone, not on a team. Not everyone who owns a baseball bat plays baseball, Tolliver snarled. He whirled to face Bert as something slammed against the front door behind him. Why of all houses did I have to break into the weaponless vegetarians? Huh? Bert scoffed at him. This was exactly why he hated being around people, why they caused him such anxiety. This man was angry at him for not being a convenient enough victim for his liking. Maybe it's your own fault, he said snidely. Maybe you should blame yourself for choosing the house in the middle of the woods instead of a house somewhere in the suburbs. Maybe people living in seclusion are there for a reason. Maybe... Something shattered the window to his right, but the duct tape over the glass held. It flexed inward but didn't snap. Bert jumped and shivered. He should have called the police when he had the chance. If he had known then that more people would be coming behind the first, he would have. They will be getting in here soon. If I call the police now, they will arrive in time to find my body. This is one of the downsides to living in the middle of nowhere. But I didn't think I would need the police out here. I thought that was one of the benefits. I didn't think anyone would even know I was out here, never mind to bother me. I thought I would just be contesting with the raccoons. Bert watched his fingers work their way through the duct tape and tugged at it, trying to create an opening. He watched as Tolliver gracefully and casually strode over and grabbed those fingers in his right hand. He used one of Bert's kitchen knives, a non-serrated butcher knife in his left hand, to saw through them. It was slow and loud, the stainless steel grinding when it hit bone, but Tolliver forced his way through, snapping tendons like rubber bands until the digits plopped to the ground one by one. Bert just looked on in horror as the person on the other side of the duct-taped window screamed and struggled, thrashing and creating a rolling wave of silver. The fingerless hand was gushing downward, a wave of crimson further ruining Bert's carpet. Bert put a hand to his mouth, trying to keep his bile down. He couldn't take his eyes off of the fingers on the carpet, but he did when he felt Tolliver staring at him. "I did what I had to do, and there's going to be a lot more of that. You need to put your big boy pants on and focus on survival." Bert took a deep breath. "Well, that's classically toxic," he said. "Someone isn't less of a man if they're not cool with violence and murder." Tolliver grabbed a handful of Bert's shirt. Bert's eyes rolled down to look at the blood that still stained the hands that held his shirt, and he grimaced. "Seriously?" Tolliver snarled as something banged against the front door again, moving the recliner pinned against it. "I'm beginning to think I need to change my tactic and just kill you." Bert was taken aback by the statement. He blinked several times. "Well, I'm glad that wasn't in your original game plan. So what exactly was your plan?" Tolliver huffed and released him. He spun to look at the already broken window by the door. The baking sheet was being pushed inward. The tape fixing it to the sill wouldn't last forever. It was already starting to give. "My plan has always been to survive, but it was also to remain human." Bert bit back his smartass retort. Did the intruder mean that killing him made him less than human? Perhaps he is one of those talk show crazies who thought he was a space alien. Maybe I'm going to find out if the moon is full tonight. He couldn't help but think about the people outside referring to Tolliver as it. Finally, he said, "How?" "By surviving without it. Without you," Tolliver said. The metal pan broke free. It was still attached to the tape, but it hung limply by the window's side. Bert stared fearfully at the man on the other side, gun in hand, pointing through the window, a grim look upon his face. Tolliver moved faster than Bert would have thought possible. He flinched and looked away as his own hammer was brought down upon the wrist of the hand that held the gun. The man cried out, and Bert heard the gun clatter to the floor. He couldn't resist the urge to look back at the unfolding scene, but he regretted it when he actually did. Bert turned to look just as Tolliver jammed a steak knife into the man's throat, and a geyser of crimson erupted, splashing Bert in the face. He cried out as the dead man fell away past the open window. "I thought killing wasn't in the plan," Bert said, feeling sick. "Killing you wasn't in the plan," Tolliver said back as he bent to retrieve the gun from the floor. "These vermin won't leave me alone if I don't kill them. They definitely all need to die." Bert gave a long exhale as he wiped blood and bits of flesh from his eyes and mouth. He could taste the metallic, coppery flavor in his stained mouth, and it made him feel sick. "Well, okay then. Glad you found a more suitable weapon. I'm going to retire to my bedroom if you don't mind. I want to be out of the path of any more flying fluids." "I do mind. You stay by me." Tolliver looked at him, and Bert took a step back. The man's face and hoodie had been hit by the blood spray as well. It gave him a wild, animalistic look. Bert wanted to argue, but he wasn't going to argue with the man covered in the blood of his enemies. "And don't look at me like that. Can you give me a towel or something to wipe it off?" It took Bert a second to register what the man had actually asked him. "I thought you said stay by you. Make up your mind." "Oh, yeah, right, of course," Bert said. He ran to the bathroom. The bathroom window was pushed open, and there was an arm hanging in when he got there. Bert yelped and started beating at it wildly. The person the arm belonged to cussed, and the arm pulled back. Bert snagged a towel off of his rack and hurried back to the living room to find the woman he had seen outside laying on the floor. Her head turned at an awkward angle, and her bulbous, protruding eyes were now staring at nothing. Her neck bulged, a stray chunk of severed vertebrae breaking through the skin like it was trying to escape. Bert was staring at her as he extended the towel to Tolliver. "Is she—" Yes. Bert looked up to see Tolliver wipe his face. I guess I can just buy a new towel, Bert thought. What he said was, someone was coming through in the bathroom. Tolliver sighed. I can't watch all the entry points. You have to help me. Can you shoot if you did have a gun? You're going to give me the gun? The gun that belonged to a killer? That has probably been used in a million crimes and I'm going to get my fingerprints all over? Not to mention I could just shoot you with it. Tolliver rolled his eyes. You wouldn't be foolish enough to try to shoot me with it after seeing what happened to the last guy. Bert reached out and accepted the gun. Fair point, he said. Dad taught my brother and I to shoot young. I haven't done it in a long time because I don't like guns and what they bring to the world, but I know how. Touching story, Tolliver said. Just face the bedroom and anyone you see, shoot. Bert shook his head. If I do, it'll be in the arm or leg or something. I'm not like you. I can't. Bert looked down at the dead woman's fat tongue lolling out the side of her mouth like a golden retriever on a car ride that got stung by a bee. Do that. Whatever makes you happy, Tolliver said. Just know that they won't give the same courtesy. Why? Why is any of this happening? Tolliver sighed. Some people don't believe in progress. They think people are what they are, and that's all they'll ever be. They don't give anyone the chance to change, and if someone does change, they work their asses off to prove the person didn't change at all. Bert raised an eyebrow. I'm assuming the person in this incredibly vague story is you, so I might die because of cancel culture? I'm in the woods. I tried to cancel myself. What are a group of armed killers trying to prevent you from changing? Do they want to prove that you're still a killer because... Tolliver shook his head. He pulled a necklace from his shirt and held a cross emblem in his hand. God is testing me, he said, closing his eyes and kissing it. He led me to you as a test of my willpower. Bert saw movement go past the broken window and he raised the gun and fired. The shot was loud and sheetrock exploded. Tolliver flinched and looked at him like he had gone mad. You missed them and almost hit me, he said. Switch. Bert looked at the steak knife the man was holding out to him and he shook his head. I feel better with the gun. Well, we know you know how to use the steak knife because you nailed my damned hand to the door. Just take it and give me the gun. No. A gunshot came from behind Bert from way of the bedroom. It sliced through his shoulder and chipped away at the wall beside Tolliver's head. Tolliver snarled in response, dropped to one knee and hurled the steak knife. Bert, holding his shoulder, spun around in time to see the steak knife embed itself between a stranger's shocked eyes, a thin line of red running past the bridge of his crooked nose. He dropped to the ground with a hard thump. I told you to watch the damn bedroom, Tolliver growled from behind him. You also told me to give you the gun. Now I've been shot. Tolliver grabbed him hard and yanked him closer, tugging his injured arm for a better look. Bert yelped in pain. Tolliver inspected the wound and then pushed him back. It's little more than a cut. You'll live. Still hurts, Bert said bitterly. I'll watch the bedroom, but you gotta move the body. Tolliver snarled and lunged at him. He squeezed his hands into fists. Move it yourself if you want it moved. I'm this close to ripping your throat out and becoming the monster these people want me to be. I will bleed you dry. Well, that's really freaking nice. Bert really wanted to fire off back at him, but he was smart enough to realize that he was pushing the man too far. The guy was obviously dangerous. He had proven that well enough already. Bert bit his tongue, tucked the gun into his pants, and walked over to the body on the floor of his bedroom. Doing his best not to look at it, he grabbed a limb and dragged it around behind his bed where it was out of sight. He went to move back when he heard a click and the quietly spoken word, "Don't." Bert froze. A chill ran through him and made him tremble. "Please don't kill me," he said quietly. "Do you know what that is? That you're hiding and helping?" The voice whispered into his ear. "Do you understand what is waiting for us both in the other room?" "I know he's a killer, but are you any better?" Bert said. "All of you broke into my house." Bert immediately shut his eyes and kicked himself for being so bad at keeping his mouth shut. "This is one reason I don't interact with people. I'm no good at it. My filters don't work as well as other people's. Part of being an ass pie, I suppose." "What's going on in there?" Tolliver called from the other room. Bert almost sighed with relief when he realized that Tolliver wouldn't be coming. He couldn't abandon the broken window and door. "Hurry up and get back. I said to stay by me." "Tell the monster you're fine," the voice said into Bert's ear, something hard pressed against his head to drive the point home. Bert licked his lips and took a deep breath. "Nothing," he called back to Tolliver. "Watching this bathroom window. It's wide open now." "Good," the voice said from behind him. "Now I'm going to back up, and I want you to slowly head for that bathroom window. Go out of it. If you run in any direction, I'll put you down like a rabid dog." Bert swallowed the lump that had risen in his throat and he nodded. "If we find that you're aiding him, or worse, that you're like him, we'll come for you next. If you really are just caught up in this, you'll be safe and free to go once you're outside." Bert felt the person behind him move away. He swallowed again and turned towards the bathroom very slowly, his eyes rolling to the side for a glance at the man that held him at gunpoint. He couldn't get a look. A loud crash sounded from the other room and was followed by a series of thumps and bangs. Bert's breath seized in his chest. He trembled as he walked one step at a time towards the bathroom. "I can't believe I'm doing this," he thought. When he reached the doorway to the bathroom, Bert eyed the window that was in fact wide open now, and then he closed his eyes and exhaled. Tugging the gun from his pants, he spun on his heel and fired before he even got a good look at the man he was shooting at. There was a bang and then a thud, and the guy went down. Bert, heart racing and pounding, went back into the bedroom for a closer look and to see if he had actually just killed someone. He hoped he didn't. That wasn't something he was ready to live with. The man on the ground looked up at him, his face a portrait of agony. Bert's eyes moved to the dying man's hand and saw that it was gunless. He followed a straight line across the floor to his dresser and saw where it lay. Then he looked back at the man. The guy's breathing was shallow, his hand on the growing stain spreading through the shirt on his chest, crimson drool running out of the side of his mouth. He wasn't dead, but he would be before long if he didn't get immediate medical attention. Then Bert the loner would be. Bert the murderer. Because that's what I need. I should have run for the car when I had the chance. That thing will kill you. The man coughed, spraying a bloody spittle that Bert turned away from. Still, he could feel it wet his shoulder. It'll kill us all. Bert could feel someone's presence and he looked towards the doorway. Tolliver stood in it, looking at him. He was even bloodier than he had been earlier, his long hair matted to his head and clumped with red. It was caked all over his face, crusting his eyes, cheeks, and chin. He was the last of this wave, Tolliver said. You did well, but there'll be more, so I need to requisition your car. You do have a car, right? Bert took a deep breath and walked up to stare the man in the face. He searched Tolliver's eyes for a moment but found nothing out of the ordinary. I'm not giving you my car. I'll take you where you want to go, but I'm driving. We're both misfits. I get that much, but before we go anywhere, you need to tell me what these people think you are. Why do they want you dead? Tolliver sighed and walked back into the living room. Bert followed him and immediately gagged at what he saw. The front door was wide open, the recliner on its back on the floor nearby. There was a man bent backwards, draped over the back of the couch like a blanket, his head bashed in, most likely with the hammer. Rivulets of crimson ran down from his concave skull, over his smashed and broken, barely discernible face to pool on the couch cushion. One lone eyeball hung from the mess that used to be a face, and it stared directly at Bert. Gah! Even in a life or death situation, is it necessary to be that brutal? Bert put a hand to his mouth and turned away from the grisly scene, but in his mind, he saw the violence play out. A wild Tolliver smashing the person in the face over and over as their bones broke and the face fell in on itself, like they were no more than a clay sculpture filled with blood. That blood and more had sprayed everywhere. When Bert opened his eyes, he sighed with disgust. His living room was covered. The windows, furniture, carpet, broken door, and even the ceiling wore a fresh coat of red. They want me dead because I already am, Tolliver said to him, drawing Bert's attention away from the gore. I'm a vampire, or at least I was. I detoxed. Starving myself of blood returned my mortality. Abstaining made me human again, but one drink will bring it all back. I can taste it on my lips, and I'm craving it so bad, but it's merely physical. I want to stay human, to live a normal life, but these people won't ever see me as anything other than what I used to be. In my other state, there's little they can do to me. I'm immortal. But in this more human state, I'm susceptible to things just like you are, you know? Like a steak knife to the hand. They're trying to force me into a situation where my life is in danger and I have to drink in order to stay alive. It'll prove I'm a monster. I didn't want to give them that satisfaction, but you were making it really tempting every time you opened your mouth. Bert dropped his hand and glared at this man that had broken into his home and brought all this chaos and violence into his life. You asshole, he said, and Tolliver actually looked surprised. You made fun of me for being a vegetarian, you hypocrite. Tolliver chuckled and shook his head. That's the part you're upset about? Why did you want the steak if it would turn you back? Tolliver sighed. I thought if I needed to be immortal to survive, I could at least do it without killing a human. Bert thought for a moment. When you had that blood all over your face, was it tempting? It still is, all of it. I can smell it, taste it on my tongue, feel it inside, calling to me. And yet you asked me to get you a towel. Tolliver met his eyes and nodded. I could use another. All right, Bert told him. That's good enough for me. I've never much cared for what people think. There's more towels in the linen closet. I'll meet you in the car. Fishing his keys from his pocket, Bert walked past a dumbfounded Tolliver through the broken front door of his house and out into the night. As he reached the car, Bert could hear someone racing up behind him and his heart jumped. He turned inside with relief to see it was just Tolliver. Strange world when you're relieved to see the man that broke into and destroyed your house and made you an accomplice to murder. Bert used the keyless entry to unlock the car with a couple of loud beeps, and both men turned to look for threats. When they saw none, they opened the doors and got in, quickly closing them. As Bert started the car, he looked at Tolliver and asked, The garlic and the cross. Tolliver snorted. Oh, rubbish. Made-up movie nonsense. Figures, Bert said as he backed the car out of the garage. So, why are you coming with me? Is it just because I wrecked your house? Bert's eyes were on the road when he answered, No, it's because we're both different. We're both alone. We both just ache to be normal and okay, and feel like the world won't let us. I don't like being around other people, but I feel like you might get it. Tolliver just nodded and turned to gaze out the window. Then he yelled, Look out! Someone came tearing out of the woods, running straight for their car, arm raised high, holding an axe, a wooden stake in the hand tucked at their hip. Bert just pushed down on the gas and accelerated. They hit the charging man head on, and he flew into the air to only land back on the hood of the car in a mess of tangled limbs, his wild face smooshed against the glass of the windshield. Bert slammed the brakes and the man toppled off like a marionette with severed strings. Without hesitation, Bert drove the car over him, and it jostled him around like he was going too fast over a speed bump. Tolliver was looking at him with shock and awe and what Bert hoped was a little bit of respect and admiration. Bert just smiled and watched the passing trees. I'm already riding with the vampire, he thought. Maybe we'll find Bigfoot out here too.
Chilling tales for dark nights.